The gold rush created a society where lawlessness was endemic and institutional authority was almost entirely absent. The region was newly ceded from Mexico, lacking established American courts, judges, or prisons. This legal vacuum was immediately exploited by criminals, leading to a constant state of social instability that demanded extreme solutions. Claim disputes and violence. In the mining camps, the primary source of conflict was the claim dispute. In the absence of federal surveys, miners operated under informal mining district rules, which they themselves established and enforced. These rules, covering the size of a claim and the conditions for forfeiture, were constantly challenged. A boundary dispute over a rich vein or a conflict over water rights, critical for sluicing, could escalate from argument to shooting in minutes. The law was enforced by the nearest angry mob or the quickest draw. This environment attracted not just honest prospectors, but organized gangs of robbers, claim jumpers, and confidence men who specialized in exploiting the chaos. The rise of the vigilance committees. In San Francisco, where the wealth was centralized and crime, theft, arson, and murder was rampant, the citizenry demanded action. When the appointed civilian government proved utterly incapable of controlling the disorder, the populace resorted to the terrifying extra-legal mechanism of the Vigilance Committee. The Vigilance Committee of 1851 and the far larger Committee of 1856 were composed primarily of the city's most prominent merchants and businessmen, men who had the most to lose from instability. They argued that their actions were necessary to protect property and civic virtue where the courts had failed, often due to corruption or inefficiency. These committees acted as judge, jury, and executioner. They held swift, often biased trials, issued warnings, ordered banishments, and famously carried out several public hangings. While celebrated by many as essential to restoring order, the committees were fundamentally anti-democratic, proving that in the extreme conditions of the gold rush, the community prioritized swift, brutal control over the slow, protective due process of law. Their actions were a temporary solution to the legal vacuum, but they cast a long, unsettling shadow over California's eventual entry into the Union. The first American law. Despite the vigilance committees, the necessity of stable commerce eventually forced the establishment of lasting legal structures. One of the first legal acts of the new California government was to address the complex issue of water rights. The English common law principle of riparian rights, which gave water rights only to landowners adjacent to a stream, was entirely unsuitable for hydraulic mining in a dry climate. Instead, California adopted the frontier doctrine of prior appropriation, the principle of first in time, first in right. The first miner to divert water for a beneficial use maintained the right to that water, even if it meant cutting off the supply to downstream users. This legal innovation, born of necessity in the gold fields, fundamentally reshaped water law across the American West, demonstrating how the unique challenges of the frontier forced the abandonment of traditional Eastern legal codes in favor of pragmatic, custom-made law. The gold rush did not just draw Americans, it drew a global cross-section, instantly creating a multi-ethnic society defined by economic opportunity and deep-seated racial prejudice. The promise of the goldfields was universal, but access to that wealth was rigidly controlled by ethnic and legal discrimination. The dispossession of the Californios. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to respect the property rights of the Mexican citizens, Californios, who remained in the ceded territory. However, this promise was almost immediately broken. The Californios owned massive tracts of land based on the old vague Spanish and Mexican land grants. The American influx led to relentless squatting and legal challenges. The U.S. Congress established the Land Act of 1851,
which required Californios to prove the legality of their grants before a land commission. This process was ruinously expensive, slow, and relied on American legal principles that disregarded the customs of the Mexican system. Many Californios, unable to afford years of litigation and lawyer fees, were forced to sell off portions of their land to pay their legal debts, leading to the systematic dispossession of the landed aristocracy.
The scapegoating of the Chinese. Starting in 1850, thousands of immigrants from China, drawn by the phrase Gold Mountain, arrived in California. They were initially welcomed as an economic necessity, but quickly became victims of intense racial discrimination. American miners resented the Chinese community's communal labor practices and willingness to work abandoned claims for less profit. In response, the California legislature passed the Foreign Miners Tax. While ostensibly applied to all foreign miners, it was primarily enforced against the Chinese and Mexican miners, forcing them to pay crippling monthly fees to work their claims. When Chinese miners moved into other industries, the discrimination followed, leading to anti-Chinese legislation that foreshadowed the later Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The genocide of indigenous Californians. For the indigenous populations of California, the gold rush was an unmitigated catastrophe, a period of outright genocide. The native population, estimated at over 150,000 before the gold rush, was reduced to less than 30,000 by 1870. Miners, desperate for land and resources, often actively sought to eliminate native resistance. Organized massacres were common. The state government, rather than protecting these groups, sometimes subsidized their removal or destruction through local militias. The immense environmental destruction caused by hydraulic mining further destroyed native food sources, driving them into starvation and conflict. The gold rush was thus not only an economic boom for America, but a demographic and moral collapse for the original inhabitants of the land. The California Gold Rush, though a brief 9-year phenomenon, left an indelible mark on the political and economic trajectory of the United States, irrevocably reshaping the nation and accelerating its transition to a modern continental power. Acceleration of statehood and sectional conflict. The sudden population surge was so immense that California bypassed the traditional territorial stage entirely. It applied for statehood in 1849 and was admitted in 1850 as a free state. This immediate entry upset the delicate balance of power between slave and free states in the Senate, triggering the massive legislative crisis that resulted in the Compromise of 1850. The gold rush thus acted as a powerful accelerant to the sectional conflict, throwing a massive new free state into the Union and bringing the issue of slavery in the territories to a head faster than anyone anticipated. Economic revolution and the birth of Western capital. The influx of gold, estimated to be nearly $2 billion worth in the first decade, had a revolutionary effect on the global economy. It helped fuel industrial expansion in the East, facilitated the funding of the Transcontinental Railroad, and stabilized the American financial system. San Francisco became the undisputed financial capital of the West, the hub for capital, trade, and banking, giving rise to institutions that would later dominate the world stage. The gold rush essentially transferred global wealth from the old world to the new, providing the essential capital base for the American Industrial Revolution. The infrastructure of connection. The rush created an intense national need for rapid connection. The journey around Cape Horror or across the plains was unsustainable. This urgent demand for speed spurred massive infrastructural innovation. The Pony Express, 1860 to 1861, a brief, romantic, but crucial experiment that proved the viability of overland communication, cutting mail times significantly. The telegraph. The gold rush provided the economic rationale to prioritize a transcontinental telegraph line, which was completed in 1861, instantly rendering the Pony Express obsolete and linking California to the rest of the nation in real time. The Transcontinental Railroad. Most significantly, the gold rush provided the ultimate economic and strategic justification for the Transcontinental Railroad, begun during the Civil War.
The need to transport gold, goods, and people efficiently between the resource-rich West and the industrial East became a national imperative, fundamentally shrinking the continent. The gold rush was the pivotal moment where manifest destiny ceased to be merely an ideology and became a demographic and economic fact. It took a barren, newly acquired land and instantly populated it with a dynamic, if deeply flawed, society. It accelerated the Civil War, funded the industrial North, and established the permanent cultural template of the American West, a land of high-risk capitalism, technological ingenuity, and ruthless social competition. The 49ers chased gold, but in doing so, they inadvertently laid the foundations for a transcontinental superpower.
For decades before 1862, the vast public domain of the American West, stretching across the Mississippi and beyond, was a source of bitter political contention. The dominant system of land distribution favored not the poor farmer, but the wealthy land speculator. Under policies like the Land Act of 1820, the government sold land for cash at a minimum price of $1.25 per acre, but required a minimum purchase of 80 acres. For a poor family, the upfront cost of $100 was prohibitive. Consequently, speculators would buy up the best land, fertile riverfronts, timber-rich plots, and strategically located areas, and then resell it to desperate settlers at exorbitant inflated prices, often keeping the homesteader in perpetual debt. This system choked the agrarian dream of Thomas Jefferson, ensuring that the bounty of the continent enriched the urban financier, not the honest tiller of the soil. The idea of granting public land for free soil, was a powerful political current driven by the emerging Republican Party and northern industrial interests. Proponents argued that giving land directly to the poor would encourage independent yeomanry, provide a necessary safety valve for the rapidly industrializing East, and fostered truly democratic citizenship. However, every attempt to pass a homestead bill was fiercely blocked by the Southern political bloc. Southern politicians saw free land through the lens of slavery. They correctly feared that free land would inevitably lead to free labor. If small farmers could claim 160 acres without capital, the territories would be rapidly filled by small-scale anti-slavery farmers from the North and Europe, effectively preventing the expansion of the plantation system and shifting the political balance of power permanently toward the North. The issue was not merely land distribution, it was the existential question of whether the West would be economically built on chattel slavery or on free wage-earning labor. Homestead bills were repeatedly passed by the House, only to be deliberately killed in the Senate or vetoed by pro-Southern presidents. The entire deadlock broke violently in 1861 with the secession of the Southern states and the beginning of the Civil War. With the Confederate delegates gone, the Republican majority seized the opportunity. The war provided the perfect justification. The North needed to solidify control over the West, secure the loyalty of the territories, and provide a post-war vision for rewarding Union veterans and immigrants. In the midst of a national crisis, the long-sought ideal of free land finally became achievable, transforming a century of debate into decisive legislation. On May 20, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law. It was arguably the most significant piece of land legislation in U.S. history, fundamentally reshaping the economic, political, and demographic landscape of the nation for the next 50 years. The act was a testament to the belief that land was not just a commodity for speculation, but a tool for democracy and national development. The core promise of the act was brilliantly simple and profoundly radical: 160 acres of surveyed public land for free. To claim this land, an applicant had to meet only a few fundamental requirements. Be the head of household. This was intentionally inclusive. It meant the applicant could be a man, a woman, an immigrant, provided they declared their intention to become a citizen, or a former slave. Be at least 21 years old, a standard legal requirement for entering into a contract. Pay a nominal fee,
A small filing fee, typically $10 to $18, was required to cover administrative costs, making the land virtually free. The 5-year rule, the Commitment Clause, was the Act's most important provision, designed explicitly to thwart speculators. The claimant had to improve the land for 5 consecutive years. Improvement was defined as building a habitable dwelling, a 12 by 14-foot structure was the standard, and cultivating the land. After 5 years, the homesteader could file for a final deed, proving continuous residency and improvement with the testimony of 2 neighbors. The effect of the act was immediate. It sent a powerful signal across the continent and the world. America had land, and it was offering it as the ultimate bounty. It catalyzed a demographic tidal wave that dwarfed the gold rush. The 160-acre plot, a quarter section, became the standard unit of the American dream, a piece of geometry that was expected to support a family and anchor a new democratic community. Lincoln saw the act not just as a war measure, but as a moral cornerstone. He believed that the act was essential to securing the loyalty of the Western territories and ensuring that the future growth of the nation would be built on the foundation of the independent, free farmer, the ultimate antithesis of the plantation system the Union was fighting to destroy. The act was thus both an economic policy and a deliberate act of political warfare against the Confederacy, confirming that the Union's vision of the West was one of agrarian democracy, not slaveholding aristocracy.
The Homestead Act opened the American West not just to land-hungry Easterners, but to a vast, unexpected, and diverse wave of immigrants and marginalized Americans, turning the Great Plains into one of the world's great social melting pots. The immigrant tide. European immigrants, fleeing poverty, famine, or political repression in their homelands, viewed the Homestead Act as a miracle. Germans, Scandinavians, Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes, and later Czechs and Russians, poured into the territories of Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas. For peasants who had known only tenant farming under rigid European feudal systems, the idea of owning their own land, free and clear, was the ultimate fulfillment of the American promise. Immigrant groups often practiced group migration, settling entire townships with people from their specific villages, replicating their cultural and linguistic traditions in the wilderness. The methodical, cooperative labor of these immigrants was often the key to survival in the harsh, unfamiliar environment of the plains, particularly the Swedes and Germans who brought with them traditions of communal resilience. The empowerment,
The terror of the climate. Homesteaders faced a relentless assault from the climate. Drought was the chronic enemy, often rendering crops worthless for years at a time, forcing families into destitution or abandonment. The dry climate was compounded by the arrival of massive, destructive grasshopper plagues, or locusts, in the 1870s, which descended in black clouds, consuming crops, clothing, and even the handles of farm tools, leaving behind fields of barren stubble. In the winter, the open plains offered no protection from the ferocious blizzards, which could kill livestock and isolate families for weeks, often with fatal consequences. Survival required a fundamental shift from individual labor to cooperative resilience. Barn raisings, communal digging of wells, and the sharing of precious seed grain became essential social practices. The isolation of the prairie was profound, but the challenges of the land demanded the formation of new, strong community bonds, turning neighboring claims from strangers into life-sustaining allies. Despite the democratic ideals of the Homestead Act, its promise of free land was often undermined and hijacked by systematic fraud, corporate exploitation, and the simple environmental realities of the plains. It is estimated that up to 2/3 of all initial homestead claims ultimately failed or were abandoned. The 160-acre problem. The central flaw of the act was its unit of measure, 160 acres. While sufficient for farming in the humid, fertile east, 160 acres proved fatally inadequate for the arid conditions of the high plains, where vast tracts were required for successful dry farming or ranching. Homesteaders found that a quarter section was not enough to survive in the semi-arid West, forcing them to abandon their claims or illegally acquire more land. This environmental mismatch was the primary reason for claim failure. Corporate fraud and speculation.
Land speculators quickly devised ways around the 5-year residency clause. They hired agents, known as dummy entrymen, often desperate and poor individuals, to file claims. These dummy entrymen would build a tiny temporary shack, that $10 shack, make a minimal show of cultivation for a few months, and then, after the mandatory time expired, or using various legal loopholes, like the commutation clause, which allowed claims to be bought out early for a small fee, they would immediately transfer the land to the corporation. Timber and cattle abuse. The law was particularly exploited by industries requiring massive tracts of land. Timber companies used dummy entries to acquire entire sections of valuable forests, stripping the land for profit. More notoriously, cattle barons utilized the act to consolidate huge ranching empires. By strategically filing claims on land that contained critical resources, a single stream, a spring, or a patch of grazing grass, the rancher could effectively control thousands of acres of surrounding public land, the unclaimed range, that depended on that single water source. This practice, known as fencing the water, allowed a single wealthy individual to control an entire valley with just a few legally held homestead claims. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 attempts to fix the act often created new avenues for fraud. The Timber Culture Act offered an additional 160 acres if the homesteader planted a certain number of trees. While intended to encourage afforestation, this act was massively abused. Claimants would plant a handful of trees, often poorly maintained, simply to acquire the extra land for sale. These loopholes ensured that much of the best land was never settled by honest homesteaders, but was rapidly consolidated into the hands of powerful corporate interests and large-scale ranching owners. The arrival of the homesteaders, marked by their fences and their focus on cultivation, signaled the final, inevitable conflict between two competing visions of the West: the open range of the cattle baron and the fenced democracy of the homesteader. The culture of the open range. The decades immediately following the Civil War saw the rise of the iconic cattle kingdom. Texas longhorns were driven north across the vast, unfenced plains, the open range, to railheads in Kansas, like Abilene and Dodge City. The ranchers operated on a philosophy of communal grazing. The land was free for all, and the biggest herd won. The cattle barons viewed the Homestead Act with contempt, seeing the 160-acre claims as tiny, irritating obstacles to their vast, profitable operations. The arrival of barbed wire. The primary physical weapon the homesteader possessed against the powerful cattle industry was not the gun, but the invention of barbed wire in the 1870s. Barbed wire was cheap, easy to install, and most importantly, effective against the longhorn. It allowed the homesteader to physically demarcate his 160 acres, protecting his crops from being trampled and eaten by the vast herds. The fence, not the law, became the symbol of the homesteader's sovereignty. The fence wars. The result was violent and widespread fence wars. Cattle ranchers would ride out to cut the homesteaders' new wire, destroy their crops, and intimidate or threaten the families. These conflicts were class struggles, pitting the landless wage laborer, the cowboy, and the corporate wealth of the rancher against the small-scale farmer clinging to his piece of patented land. In territories like Wyoming, where ranching interests held immense political power, the struggle was particularly brutal, often resulting in violence and even murder. The famous Johnson County War in Wyoming was a late dramatic example of the powerful ranching oligarchy attempting to use force and legal manipulation to drive out the smaller, settled homesteaders. The conflict was ultimately decided not by violence, but by the blizzard of 1886 to 1887. This catastrophic winter, which killed millions of cattle and bankrupted many of the largest open-range cattle companies, proved that the traditional system of nomadic, open-range grazing was unsustainable and financially brittle. The disaster broke the power of the cattle barons, forcing the industry to adopt fencing, supplementary feed, and regulated grazing, essentially adopting the methods of the settlers they once despised. The homesteader, symbolized by his small, fenced plot, won the economic and political war for the Great Plains, ensuring that the West would be characterized by settled agriculture rather than transient ranching. The administrative heart of the Homestead Act was the General Land Office and its regional land offices, which quickly became the epicenters of frontier bureaucracy, opportunity, and corruption. The process of turning a dream into a deed was long, complex, and filled with hurdles. The process of proving up was the key stage for the homesteader. After 5 years of continuous residency and improvement, the claimant had to appear at the local land office. He or she had to provide sworn testimony, supported by the affidavits of two neighbors, often called witnesses, confirming that the claimant had resided on the land for 5 years, built a habitable dwelling, often described in minute detail as 12 by 14 feet, 1 door, 2 glass windows, cultivated a specific number of acres, typically 10 to 15 acres.
This seemingly simple process was fraught with peril. A dishonest neighbor could easily sabotage a claim. A corrupt land agent could demand bribes or find reasons to delay the final deed, leaving the homesteader vulnerable to speculators. The GLO, an arm of the federal government, was notorious for being understaffed, overwhelmed, and often deeply intertwined with local land speculation rings. For the homesteader, the GLO was the final, intimidating barrier to true ownership. The role of the land agent. The local land agent held immense, often unchallenged power. He was the gatekeeper to wealth, capable of making or breaking a settler simply by approving or delaying paperwork. This power led to widespread corruption. Agents often tipped off speculators about which claims were about to lapse or which land was soon to be opened, allowing large companies to file their fraudulent claims first. The system demanded integrity, but was constantly tested by the immense financial stakes involved. Later amendments and expansion. As the best land was rapidly claimed, the government realized that the 160-acre plot was unworkable in the arid West. Subsequent acts were passed to adjust the size to fit the ecology. The Kincaid Act, 1904, applied only to a specific area of Nebraska, increasing the allotment to 640 acres, a full section, for grazing land. The enlarged Homestead Act, 1909, increased the standard allotment to 320 acres in semi-arid regions. The Stock Raising Homestead Act, 1916, offered 640 acres for land suitable only for grazing, finally acknowledging the demands of the environment. These amendments demonstrated the government's slow, often reactive learning curve regarding the unique challenges of the Western environment, moving away from the rigid, one-size-fits-all 160-acre blueprint to a system based more on ecological suitability. These changes extended the era of free land well into the 20th century, culminating in the final repeal of the Act in 1976. The Homestead Act stands as one of the most powerful engines of democracy and displacement in American history. Over 1.6 million homestead applications were filed, ultimately resulting in the successful transfer of land to over 600,000 claimants. This immense movement of people fundamentally settled the American interior. The taming of the plains. The act achieved its primary demographic goal. It populated the Great Plains and the Mountain West, providing the critical mass of citizens necessary for the creation of new states. The grid of 160-acre farms became the enduring, visible pattern of the American West, creating a distinctive culture of independent, if highly interdependent, agrarian life. It was the crucial step that allowed America to claim its continental destiny, transforming empty wilderness into the most productive agricultural region in the world. The cost of free land. The indigenous perspective. The fundamental moral stain on the Homestead Act was the cynical pretense that the land was free. The vast tracts distributed were not empty, but were forcibly seized from indigenous nations through broken treaties, military campaigns, and systematic displacement, often facilitated by the very GLO and military forces meant to protect settlers. The act provided the final, legal instrument for the transfer of millions of acres of ancestral indigenous territory to private, individual American ownership, effectively completing the dispossession begun by earlier policies. The homesteader success was often built directly upon the ruin of the Native American way of life. The end of the frontier. The Homestead Act was the final, decisive nail in the coffin of the American frontier.
By the 1890 census, the superintendent officially declared that a continuous unsettled frontier line no longer existed. The settlement of the Great Plains meant that the safety valve of the West, the place where the dispossessed and ambitious could always restart their lives, was effectively closed. This closure had profound psychological and political effects, forcing Americans to look inward and overseas for new challenges and new avenues for expansion. Economic and political impact. The Homestead Act solidified the Republican Party's vision of America, a nation built on free labor, industrial capital, and agrarian independence, ensuring that the post-Civil War nation would follow a northern capitalist path. It created a massive political constituency of Western farmers whose needs and demands would dominate American politics for decades, shaping policies on railroads, silver coinage, and farm subsidies. Ultimately, the 160 acres became the enduring symbol of American opportunity. It demanded 5 years of continuous back-breaking labor in the face of brutal environmental odds, but it delivered the most potent promise the Republic could offer: the chance for an ordinary man or woman, regardless of national origin or previous class, to become the owner of land, and, by extension, the master of their own destiny. The act was flawed, exploited, and built on moral violence, but its massive impact on the size, character, and economy of the modern United States is incalculable. The dream of the 160 acres was fulfilled, but the price was nothing less than the transformation of a continent. The dream of linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans with a line of iron rails predated the Civil War by at least 2 decades. As the American frontier pressed inexorably westward, first with the Long Hunters, then the Gold Rush, and finally with the Homesteaders, the need for rapid, reliable connection became not just an economic desire, but a strategic imperative. The discovery of gold in California in 1848, followed by its admission as a free state in 1850, made the isolation of the Pacific coast intolerable. The journey, a dangerous 6 months by wagon or an expensive, disease-ridden voyage around Cape Horn, was no longer tenable for a continental power. However, the political climate of the 1850s proved an impenetrable barrier to any massive federal project. The question of where to build the railroad became yet another devastating proxy battle in the escalating sectional conflict over slavery. Northern interests favored a route originating from Chicago, passing through territories that were generally assumed to be free soil, maximizing economic benefits for northern cities. Southern interests demanded a route originating from a city like Memphis or New Orleans, passing through the slave territories of Texas, thereby strengthening the Southern economy and potentially securing slavery's expansion into the Southwest. Congress repeatedly commissioned surveys, most notably the 5 Pacific Railroad surveys between 1853 and 1855, led by the War Department, which confirmed that several routes were geographically feasible. But every time a bill was brought before Congress, it was killed by sectional infighting. Neither side would allow the federal government to finance a project that would inevitably benefit and empower the rival section. The railroad, the ultimate symbol of unity and progress, ironically became the ultimate source of national division. The deadlock finally shattered with the secession of the Southern states in 1861. With the Confederate delegation absent from Washington, the Republican-dominated Congress gained the necessary political consensus to proceed with its Northern vision. For President Abraham Lincoln, the railroad was more than an economic necessity. It was a war measure. Securing California's gold, which financed the Union effort, and ensuring the loyalty of the Pacific states was paramount. The railroad was a physical assertion of the Union's continental claim, binding the country together with steel while it tore itself apart with internal conflict. The war provided the political urgency and the financial justification to finally undertake the most ambitious engineering project of the era. The urgency of the Civil War provided the momentum for the legislative framework of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, a landmark piece of legislation that utilized federal power and land grants to make the impossible possible. It established a definitive plan for two companies to build the line simultaneously toward a meeting point in the West. The two mandated companies were the Union Pacific Railroad, UP, to build west from Omaha, Nebraska, at the edge of the settled frontier, and the Central Pacific Railroad, CP, to build east from Sacramento, California, navigating the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. The government offered unprecedented financial and physical incentives to these private companies, transforming the project from a risk-laden venture into a potential bonanza. These incentives included land grants. For every mile of track laid, the companies were granted 10 square miles, 6,400 acres of public land, 5 square miles on each side of the track, in alternating sections. This land, which was often sold to settlers and speculators, became the company's primary source of wealth. This system immediately turned the railroads into the largest landowners in the West. Federal loans. The government provided direct loans, known as U.S. bonds, that escalated based on the difficulty of the terrain.
The act was revolutionary because it established a model of mixed enterprise, a public-private partnership where federal resources were used to underwrite corporate profit in exchange for national infrastructure. The rivalry was immediately baked into the legislation. The faster a company built, the more land and bonds it received, fueling a frantic, desperate race to lay track. Despite the legislative clarity, the act's generosity immediately attracted a class of investors focused less on transportation and more on financial exploitation. The government had opened the door not only to the construction of a railroad, but to an unprecedented vast source of capital, debt, and political corruption that would ultimately stain the entire project. The Iron Horse was born of necessity and financed by the continent's most generous subsidy. The two companies created to build the railroad were controlled by two very different but equally ruthless sets of men, whose methods defined the Gilded Age of American industry: the Union Pacific and the Ames dynasty. The Union Pacific was championed by Oakes Ames and his brother Oliver Ames, Jr., powerful Republican congressmen and shovel manufacturers from Massachusetts. Oakes Ames was the political muscle, ensuring favorable legislation and funding flowed through Washington. The Ames brothers' interest lay not in operating a railroad, but in building it as quickly and cheaply as possible to maximize federal subsidies. To facilitate this, they created the infamous Credit Mobilier of America. Credit Mobilier was a construction company created by the UP directors themselves. It contracted with the UP to build the railway, allowing the directors to pay themselves exorbitant, inflated rates, siphoning off federal bonds and taxpayer money into their own private accounts. The UP was thus structurally designed for massive, profitable corruption from its inception. The Central Pacific and the Big Four. The Central Pacific, based in California, was controlled by 4 Sacramento merchants, known collectively as the Big Four. They were a partnership of relentless, often brutal ambition. Collis P. Huntington, the chief lobbyist and financial mastermind, based in New York and Washington, ensuring the flow of money and political influence. Leland Stanford, the political figurehead, serving as governor of California and later a senator, who provided the local legislative cover. Charles Crocker, the superintendent of construction, whose logistical genius and harsh discipline drove the Central Pacific's labor force through the Sierra Nevada. Mark Hopkins, the quiet, meticulous bookkeeper who managed the accounts and finances. The Big Four's immediate challenge was not financial, but geographic. They were required to conquer the towering granite barrier of the Sierra Nevada. They, too, were masters of financial manipulation, using their political connections and control over the California legislature to ensure the land grants were maximized, demonstrating that both the eastern and western halves of the Iron Horse were built not just on steel and sweat, but on a foundation of political self-dealing and corporate greed. The Central Pacific's journey was immediately fraught with the staggering physical challenge of the Sierra Nevada.
This mountain range, with its sheer granite cliffs, deep canyons, and annual snowfall reaching 40 feet, presented a colossal barrier to 19th century engineering. Charles Crocker initially struggled to recruit a reliable workforce. White laborers found the work too dangerous, the pay too low, and the conditions too brutal, quickly abandoning the project for the remaining lure of the gold mines. Facing a crippling labor shortage, Crocker reluctantly accepted the suggestion of utilizing Chinese immigrants. Initially, they were viewed with skepticism by the foreman, who doubted the physical endurance of the Celestials. However, the Chinese workers, often recruited from Guangdong province, quickly proved to be the most reliable, disciplined, and resourceful component of the CP workforce. They worked in coordinated, cooperative gangs, often organizing their own food and sanitation, which drastically reduced disease, a common killer of white laborers. The engineering feats performed by the Chinese workers were legendary and terrifying. Their primary task was to carve 15 tunnels through solid granite, including the 1,659-foot summit tunnel at over 7,000 feet elevation. To achieve this, they were often suspended in woven baskets down sheer cliff faces, where they chipped out small ledges, set charges, and detonated powerful, unstable nitroglycerin explosives. The danger was immense. Historians estimate that up to 1,200 Chinese laborers lost their lives, either through tunnel explosions, rock slides, or exhaustion in the extreme winter conditions. In the deep snows of the Sierra, they worked under massive protective snow sheds or within the tunnels, cutting through ice and granite for weeks without seeing daylight. The Chinese contribution was central not only to the CP's physical success, but to its competitive edge. Paid less than their white counterparts and subjected to Crocker's relentless demands, their disciplined efficiency allowed the Central Pacific to maintain an astonishing pace through impossible terrain. Their work, defined by dangerous ingenuity and extreme sacrifice, was the human engine that drove the rails over the tallest obstacle on the continent, proving that American expansion was built on the backs of immigrant labor. If the Central Pacific conquered the mountains, the Union Pacific conquered the plains, facing challenges that were logistical, environmental, and military. The UP's construction began in Omaha, Nebraska, and pushed rapidly across the vast, treeless expanse of the Great Plains, driven by the need to maximize easy mileage and, consequently, high government subsidies. The UP labor force was predominantly composed of Irish immigrants, often Civil War veterans, who had nothing left to lose. They were a rough, hard-drinking, and aggressive crew used to grueling manual labor. Their work required brute force, grading flat land, driving spikes, and wrestling heavy iron rails into position. The UP crews lived in the infamous Hell on Wheels towns, mobile, lawless settlements of tents and shacks that followed the railhead, catering to the laborers with saloons, gambling halls, and rampant vice. These towns represented the raw, chaotic energy of the moving frontier, creating an immediate and often violent social environment. The UP's greatest environmental challenge was not mountains, but logistics. Every spike, tie, rail, and locomotive had to be shipped up the Missouri River to Omaha and then carted west across the vast treeless plains. The sheer scale of the material transport required an entirely new level of industrial organization.
However, the most persistent threat to the Union Pacific was military. The route traversed the traditional hunting grounds of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, who viewed the railroad as an existential invasion of their territory. The railroad was a physical breach of treaties and a harbinger of the end of the buffalo herds that sustained their way of life. Native American raids on surveying teams, construction camps, and supply lines were frequent and often devastating. The UP was forced to operate in a constant state of armed alert. Many of the workers were veterans, and the construction crews were often protected by military escorts led by generals who were fresh from the Civil War. The building of the Union Pacific was, in effect, a military operation that permanently secured the Central Plains for American settlement, ensuring that the Iron Horse would serve as the ultimate instrument of manifest destiny and indigenous displacement. The monumental achievement of the Transcontinental Railroad was tragically overshadowed by one of the largest financial and political corruption scandals in U.S. history, the Credit Mobilier scandal. This scandal laid bare the exploitative financial structure that underpinned the entire project, revealing that the true fortunes were made not by building the rail, but by exploiting the generous federal subsidies. As established by Oakes and Oliver Ames, Credit Mobilier was the construction company hired by the Union Pacific. The UP directors, however, secretly controlled Credit Mobilier. This allowed them to award construction contracts to themselves at ridiculously inflated prices, ensuring massive personal profits that dwarfed the actual cost of construction. For example, a mile of track that might cost $30,000 to build was contracted to Credit Mobilier for $70,000, with the difference being pocketed by the Ames brothers and their associates. The critical stage of the corruption involved insulating the scheme from government oversight. Oakes Ames, acting as a congressman, shrewdly distributed stock in Credit Mobilier to dozens of influential U.S. congressmen, senators, and even Vice President Schuyler Colfax. These shares were sold far below their actual value, a thinly disguised form of bribery designed to buy silence and political protection from any investigation. The politicians, now financially implicated, ensured that federal oversight was minimal and that the flow of subsidies remained constant. The scandal erupted publicly in 1872 during the presidential election campaign, revealing a staggering breach of public trust. While several key political figures were censured or implicated, very few faced legal consequences. The Credit Mobilier scandal demonstrated a fundamental truth about the Gilded Age West. The massive projects of national progress were often vehicles for private enrichment and political graft. The federal government, eager for the symbolic completion of the railway, had essentially written a blank check to a few corporate insiders, costing American taxpayers tens of millions of dollars and permanently tarnishing the reputation of the first transcontinental railroad. The final phase of the railroad was a frantic, almost absurd race, driven entirely by the increasing value of the federal subsidies and land grants. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific were laying tracks toward an unknown meeting point, maximizing mileage to collect the most bonds and land. The rivalry was fierce, crossing all lines of corporate and national pride. In the final months of 1868 and early 1869, the competition escalated to ridiculous extremes. The companies began building grade lines parallel to each other for hundreds of miles across the Utah desert, competing for the right-of-way that was yet to be finalized by Congress. This meant that two grading crews were literally working side by side, moving earth and rock, sometimes even resorting to sabotage and physical fights, all to claim mileage that only one company would be paid for. Congress finally intervened, selecting Promontory Summit, Utah, north of the Great Salt Lake, as the final meeting point. The ceremony on May 10, 1869, was designed to be the ultimate triumph of national unity and engineering prowess. The Union Pacific's locomotive number 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter pulled their trains nose to nose on the single track. Dignitaries, workers, and military personnel gathered to witness the driving of the Golden Spike, the last spike. The climax was broadcast live across the nation, not through audio, but through telegraph. A wire was run from the last spike directly to the telegraph key. As Leland Stanford, the CP president, raised his silver maul, Oakes Ames was notably absent due to the Credit Mobilier scandal, the sound of the maul striking the spike was wired live to San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C. When the final tap was sent, bells rang in Philadelphia, 100 guns fired in New York, and the nation erupted in celebration. The continent was finally connected. The physical separation of the East and West, which had defined American life for 2 centuries, ended in a flash of telegraphic light and the symbolic tap of a gilded spike. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was more than an engineering achievement.
It was the single most powerful engine of American continental transformation, permanently reshaping the nation's economy, demography, and geopolitical outlook. Economic revolution. The journey from coast to coast, which once took months, was reduced to about 7 days. This dramatic reduction in transit time and cost immediately opened up the vast resources of the West, timber, cattle, silver, and gold, to the industrial markets of the East. It enabled Eastern manufactured goods to flood the Western markets, creating a unified national economy based on mass production and rapid distribution. New economic centers, from Denver to Seattle, were born or radically expanded along the rail lines.
Accelerated settlement and the end of indigenous sovereignty. The railroad created a permanent and irresistible path for massive waves of settlers. The vast federal land grants not only financed the railroad, but were actively sold by the companies to attract new farmers, miners, and towns. This influx of population proved immediately catastrophic for the remaining indigenous nations. The railroad facilitated the rapid deployment of the U.S. Army, shattered tribal hunting grounds, and, most crucially, was directly responsible for the systematic slaughter of the American bison, buffalo, which were often hunted to near extinction by commercial hunters transported by the rail. The Iron Horse effectively ended the Native American way of life on the Great Plains and marked the final, decisive victory of manifest destiny. The closure of the frontier. The railroad was the final nail in the coffin of the open American frontier, already declared closed in the 1890 census. It eliminated the psychological space of the unknown wilderness, replacing it with the rigid schedule of the modern machine. The West was no longer a mysterious, isolated region. It was part of the American economic and political network. The dawn of the Gilded Age. The financing and execution of the railroad, however, established a dark template for American industrial development. It cemented the power of the corporate titan, like the Big Four and the Ames brothers, and proved the effectiveness of political corruption on a national scale. The scandalous profits and consolidation of power associated with the railroad set the stage for the enormous monopolies and social inequalities that would define the Gilded Age. The Iron Horse physically bound the continent together, fulfilling Lincoln's vision of unity. Yet in doing so, it simultaneously accelerated the destruction of Native American culture, enshrined corporate power, and fundamentally reorganized the American landscape into a vast, interconnected industrial machine. The history of the cattle trails is a dynamic map of American expansion. Each trail was a temporary, fluid artery that quickly followed the line of least resistance, constantly shifting to skirt the rising tide of farmers, the increasing presence of the U.S. Army, and the shifting quarantine lines established by states determined to protect their agricultural interests. The trails were the visible manifestation of the tension between the transient culture of the cattle baron and the permanent ambitions of the homesteader. The enduring image of the American cowboy, the white, rugged individualist constantly locked in gun duels, is a pervasive but profoundly inaccurate myth, created largely by dime novels and Hollywood. The reality of the cowboy's life was far more complex, multi-ethnic, and brutally mundane. The reality of the job. The cowboy was, first and foremost, a wage laborer. The work was relentless, dirty, monotonous, and dangerous. The daily routine involved 12 to 18 hours in the saddle, driving cattle slowly across dusty plains, enduring searing summer heat, freezing spring rains, and the constant threat of stampedes. The cowboy's greatest skills were not gunfighting, but horsemanship, rope handling, and the ability to sing low, calming songs to a restless herd at night. Life was defined by routine, riding the flanks, point or drag position, the dustiest and lowest status job, fixing equipment, and constantly searching for water. The famous 10-gallon hat was not for show, but for catching water and providing essential shade. Pay was low, typically $25 to $40 per month, and career longevity was short, usually lasting only until a man could save enough to buy his own small tract of land.
The multi-ethnic reality. Perhaps the most significant deviation from the myth is the Cowboys' true ethnic makeup. The Cowboys were a remarkably diverse workforce, a reality driven by the simple fact that it was hard, low-paying work that white Easterners generally avoided. African Americans. After the Civil War, nearly 25% of all cowboys were African Americans, many of whom were former slaves from Texas who brought immense knowledge of cattle handling. Men like Nat Love, Deadwood Dick, became legendary for their skills. In the saddle, the color line often blurred due to the necessity of cooperative labor, offering black men a level of respect and opportunity unavailable in the Jim Crow South. Tejanos and Mexicans. Approximately 15% of cowboys were Mexican or Tejano. The entire cattle culture, the longhorn, the lariat, the bandana, the chaps, and the saddle, was inherited directly from the Mexican vaquero tradition. These skilled horsemen and laborers were foundational to the industry, despite often facing lower wages and deep prejudice from Anglo bosses. The cowboy of the open range was a composite figure, a young, itinerant laborer, often black or Mexican, wearing worn leather chaps and smelling of sweat and trail dust. He was a professional, often solitary herder whose primary tool was the rope, not the gun. The romanticized image of the white gunman was invented by writers seeking adventure, masking the hard, multicultural reality of the toughest job in the American West. The cattle drive was a commercial enterprise that moved through lands legally claimed by others, ensuring that conflict was an inherent part of the job. The tension created by the trails shaped the legal and military history of the Midwest. 1. The struggle with indigenous nations. The most profound conflict was the violation of indigenous sovereignty. The major trails, especially the Western Trail, ran directly through the treaty-guaranteed territories of the Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations in the Indian Territory, Oklahoma. These nations had signed treaties with the U.S. government, often under duress, but those treaties guaranteed them freedom from white encroachment. The cattle drives represented a massive, organized intrusion, disrupting hunting grounds, depleting vital water sources, and introducing diseases. The result was constant, low-grade warfare. In response, some native groups demanded tolls, fees, from the trail bosses to pass peacefully through their land, a practical, if humiliating, assertion of their remaining sovereignty. Other groups resorted to raiding, seizing cattle, and disrupting the drives as a form of territorial defense and resource recovery. This conflict led to increased military patrols by the U.S. Army, which was effectively serving as armed protection for the cattle industry, further undermining the native nation's ability to resist American encroachment. 2. The threat of rustling and vigilantism. The immense, often unbranded wealth moving slowly across the empty plains attracted organized crime. Rustlers were a persistent, dangerous threat, often working in gangs to cut cattle from the herd at night. The response of the ranchers and trail bosses was immediate and extra-legal. Lacking formal police or court systems hundreds of miles from the railhead, the cattlemen formed vigilance committees. Suspected rustlers were often apprehended, given a swift, rudimentary trial, and immediately hanged from the nearest tree. This brutal, instant justice, justified by the necessity of protecting high-value property in a lawless environment, established a long, terrifying precedent of frontier vigilantism that prioritized security and economic defense over due process of law. 3. The inevitable clash with settlers. As the Homestead Act drew settlers onto the plains, the conflict between the transient cattleman and the permanent farmer became unavoidable. Farmers needed water, clear land, and protection from disease. The cattle drives threatened all three. They fouled the precious water sources, they trampled crops, and the longhorns carried Texas fever, which killed the settlers' domestic breeds. Farmers responded by organizing and using the only tool they had, the quarantine line and the fence. They used shotguns to enforce state-mandated quarantines and built crude barriers to block the trails. This class conflict, pitting the corporate wealth of the open range against the democratic ideal of the small farmer, foreshadowed the final, decisive war that would end the cattle kingdom. The cattle kingdom's reign was brief and ultimately doomed by two forces: technology and weather. The philosophy of the open range, that land was an infinite, communally shared resource, was incompatible with the industrial and legal structures of the new American West. 1. The barbed wire revolution. The most revolutionary force was a seemingly innocuous invention patented in 1874 by Joseph Glidden. Barbed wire was cheap, easily transportable, and highly effective against cattle. It allowed the farmer to define, demarcate, and defend his 160-acre homestead claim against the wide-ranging longhorn herds. The fence was the physical symbol of agricultural permanence over cattle mobility. Cattle ranchers initially viewed the wire with contempt, but they soon realized its efficiency. They began using it themselves to fence off water sources and enclose private grazing land, thus moving away from the communal open-range model. The result was the fence wars of the 1880s, primarily in Texas. Desperate cowboys and rustlers often rode out to cut the wire, leading to intense violence between the fencers and the cutters. Texas eventually passed laws criminalizing fence cutting, legally cementing the right of the homesteader and the large rancher to enclose the land. Barbed wire effectively ended the nomadic cattle drive by carving up the essential north-south trails and eliminating the vast, unrestricted grazing lands.
The final devastating blow to the open-range system was delivered by the environment. Years of overgrazing, driven by reckless corporate investment and poor management, had severely depleted the natural grasses of the northern plains. The massive herds were left dangerously vulnerable. The winters of 1886 to 1887 were catastrophic. Known as the Great Die-Up, a series of brutal blizzards and extreme cold, coupled with a lack of access to sheltered grazing due to new fences, killed millions of cattle. The losses were financially ruinous. Some ranches lost 80 to 90% of their herds. The catastrophe broke the power of the foreign-owned, open-range companies and demonstrated that the romantic, free-roaming system was economically unsustainable. The cattle industry was forced to restructure. It transitioned from nomadic herding to regulated ranching, where ranchers maintained smaller, managed, and fenced herds, planted winter feed, and controlled breeding. This transformation completed the economic victory of the homesteader's model over the cattleman's dream. By the end of 1887, the great cattle drives were largely over. The open range was legally and physically enclosed, and the cowboy's job shifted from trail driving to fence mending and range management. Though the historical cattle kingdom lasted barely 20 years, the cultural legacy of the cowboy has endured for over a century, transforming into the single most potent and enduring myth in American history. The rapid and spectacular death of the real cowboy coincided with the rise of mass media, creating a powerful cultural vacuum that was immediately filled by romanticized fiction. The birth of the myth. Writers like Owen Wister, whose 1902 novel The Virginian became the prototype for all subsequent Western fiction, intentionally sanitized and romanticized the cowboy. Wister's hero was white, solitary, articulate, and embodied a self-appointed, virtuous lawfulness, often using his gun to bring justice to a chaotic world. This fictional cowboy served a vital cultural purpose for a nation rapidly transforming into an industrial society. He represented the ideals of frontier individualism, moral clarity, and self-reliance, virtues that many Americans felt were being lost in the crowded, corrupt cities of the East. The myth became a psychological refuge, a symbol of a purer, simpler American past. The cowboy and American identity. The cowboy myth was eagerly adopted as a national archetype because it was geographically and politically safe.
Unlike the figures of the slaveholder, the industrialist, or the immigrant, the cowboy offered a hero untainted by the political conflicts of the Civil War or the corruption of the Gilded Age. He was the embodiment of American freedom, defined by his horsemanship and his mastery of nature, not by birthright or wealth. This image was later amplified by Hollywood, where actors like John Wayne solidified the white, heroic, gun-slinging archetype for global consumption, exporting a sanitized version of American ruggedness to the world. The eclipse of reality. The myth deliberately ignored the painful, complex realities of the historical cowboy. The multiracial contribution. The pivotal roles of the African American, Mexican, and Tejano cowboys were deliberately minimized or erased from popular history to create a simpler, predominantly white narrative that aligned with late 19th century racial politics. The economic reality. The historical cowboy was a low-wage worker, often employed by massive, often foreign-owned corporations. The myth transformed him into a free agent, masking the fact that the open range was in reality a colossal corporate enterprise. The violence and lawlessness. The myth glorified the gunfight, but sanitized the reality of the vigilante justice, the rustling, and the economic violence inflicted upon settlers and indigenous groups. Legacy on the land. Though the drives ended, the ranching industry continued, and the influence of the cattle barons on Western politics remained potent. States like Wyoming and Montana retained political structures heavily influenced by ranching interests. The cattle drive, though transient, had permanently imprinted the American map with trails and railheads, ensuring the permanent settlement of the High Plains. The era's brief, explosive history of risk, racial complexity, and sheer endurance left behind an unmatched cultural figure, a man defined by his solitude and his relationship with the land, whose romanticized memory continues to shape how America views its own frontier past. The real cowboy was a working man. The mythic cowboy became the face of the American dream. Before the arrival of the American Railroad and the ensuing industrial frenzy, the North American plains were governed by an ecological superpower, the American bison, or buffalo. Their numbers were staggering, estimated conservatively at between 30 million and 60 million, forming the largest single concentration of large mammals on Earth. Their migrations were vast, dark rivers of muscle and hide that stretch from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Rockies to the eastern prairies. They were not merely wildlife, they were a superorganism, a biological and geophysical force that shaped the climate, the terrain, and the very existence of the Great Plains. The bison's ecological role was fundamental. Their grazing patterns pruned and fertilized the native grasses, creating the tough, deep-rooted sod that characterized the plains. Their massive hooves compacted the earth in some places and churned it in others, creating buffalo wallows that collected water and formed miniature, ephemeral ecosystems. The plains' indigenous nations, the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and Arapaho, recognized and revered the bison as the source of all life. For them, the bison was the central pillar of culture, economy, and religion. The relationship was one of sacred symbiosis, not mere hunting. A single bison provided a wealth of resources that ensured a nomadic family's survival. Food. The meat was the primary protein source, often preserved as pemmican, a mix of dried meat, rendered fat, and berries for winter sustenance. Shelter. The thick hides were meticulously prepared to create the covers for the teepees, providing insulated, easily transportable housing. Clothing and tools. The skin provided robes, moccasins, and bedding. Bones were fashioned into tools, weapons, and shovels. Horns became spoons and cups. Even the dried dung, known as buffalo chips, was the primary fuel source for cooking and heat in the treeless plains. The indigenous hunt was a carefully managed cultural ritual, often involving the use of the buffalo jump or the skilled, dangerous chase on horseback, typically only taking what was needed. The Plains nations were not dependent on the bison, they were culturally inseparable from it. Their social structure, warfare, seasonal migrations, and spiritual beliefs were all oriented around the movements and health of the massive herds. The concept of separating the native people from the buffalo was not merely economic warfare, it was an act of attempted cultural obliteration. As long as the bison reigned, the Plains nations retained their independence and sovereignty. The first act in the Great Buffalo Extermination was not a shot, but a line, the Transcontinental Railroad. The completion of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines in 1869 violently bisected the continent, carving a permanent, unhealable scar across the Great Plains and critically dividing the massive buffalo herds into two distinct, vulnerable populations, the northern herd and the southern herd. This geographical division proved fatal. The railway served as the ultimate invasion vector, bringing three key instruments of destruction.
Accessibility. The railroad provided rapid, inexpensive transportation deep into the heart of the Buffalo Range, bypassing the weeks-long journeys previously required. Market connection. Crucially, the rails offered a direct, high-volume route to eastern tanneries and industrial centers, where bison hides were suddenly in massive demand. The killing ground. The railroad tracks themselves became the favorite hunting grounds. Passengers often engaged in sport shooting, firing thousands of rounds from train windows at the passing herds, leaving the carcasses to rot where they fell, a grotesque display of wanton waste that horrified native observers. The railroad companies actively encouraged the slaughter. Herds crossing the tracks caused delays, damaged equipment, and posed a constant navigational hazard. The companies hired professional hunters to clear the right-of-way, offering free passage and often cash bonuses for every animal removed. The most notorious of these figures was Buffalo Bill Cody, who gained his fame by contracting to supply bison meat, primarily the tongue and the hump, to feed the hungry construction crews. The southern herd, concentrated near the Kansas Pacific and Santa Fe rail lines, was targeted first and became the focus of the largest, most brutal commercial killing spree the world had yet seen. The ability of the iron horse to quickly ferry hunters, ammunition, and processed hides transformed the hunt from a local practice into an industrial enterprise. The rail lines acted as the conveyor belt of death, ensuring that for every bison killed, the bounty, the hide, could be efficiently turned into cash, guaranteeing that the slaughter would continue until the economic resource was utterly exhausted. The wholesale destruction of the bison was primarily driven not by sport or military mandate at first, but by pure, unbridled commercial greed. The catalyst was a technological breakthrough in the East: industrial tanning. New chemical processes developed after the Civil War made it economically viable to process the thick bison hide into usable industrial leather, perfect for machine belts, harnesses, heavy work boots, and eventually fashionable buffalo robes. The bison hide, once a niche product, suddenly became a globally desired commodity. This demand birthed a new, ruthless breed of frontiersmen, the professional hide hunter. Thousands of men, many of them veterans of the Civil War with nothing to lose and hardened by violence, descended upon the southern plains. They were organized, efficient, and mechanized. The hunters worked in small, tightly organized teams. A team typically consisted of the hunter/shooter, the most skilled marksman tasked with killing the bison herd quickly and quietly; the skinner, teams of workers who followed the shooter, tasked with stripping the hide as quickly as possible, a gruesome, back-breaking job that paid by the hide; the hauler/wagon master,
responsible for collecting and transporting the heavy, often stinking hides to the nearest railhead town like Dodge City, Fort Worth, or Hays City. The hunters developed techniques for maximum kill efficiency. The most effective method was pounding the herd. The hunter would position himself downwind, sometimes miles away from the herd, and systematically pick off the lead animals using long-range rifles. The bison, often confused by the lack of smoke and the absence of a visible threat, would often mill around the dying members, presenting an easy target. A single skilled hunter could kill hundreds of animals in a single afternoon without the herd fleeing, a slaughter known as a stand. The scale of the killing was incomprehensible. Between 1872 and 1874 alone, estimates suggest that over 4 million bison were killed on the southern plains. The primary commodity was the hide. The meat was usually left to rot, creating an apocalyptic landscape of sun-bleached bones and festering carcasses. The commercial hunt was a self-perpetuating, brutal cycle. The hide provided the cash to buy more ammunition and supplies, which allowed the hunter to kill more bison. By 1875, the southern herd was effectively extinct. The economic incentive, coupled with the access provided by the railroad, guaranteed the near-total destruction of one of the world's greatest animal populations in less than a decade. The industrial-scale slaughter of the bison would have been impossible without a singular technological advancement: the Sharps rifle. This high-powered, single-shot, breech-loading rifle, particularly the .50 and .45 caliber Buffalo rifles, was the perfect weapon for the task. Its massive cartridge provided the necessary knockdown power to drop a bull weighing over a ton, and its precision sights allowed hunters to kill at ranges up to 500 yards or more. The Sharps rifle was literally the tool that turned biology into commerce. The logistical efficiency of the killing teams was equally critical. The work was divided and industrialized. While the shooter executed the kill, the skinner teams were the workhorses. They were often paid around $2.50 per hide and had to work at a furious pace to skin the massive animals before the hides stiffened. The sheer volume of material required a coordinated system of transport. The hides, once stripped, were cured with salt, folded, and piled onto huge wagons, often drawn by massive freight wagons or teams of mules, to be hauled over vast, dusty distances to the railhead town. At the railhead towns, Dodge City, which thrived as the buffalo capital of the world, the hides were baled and loaded onto trains. The railroad's refrigerated cars, or simply the use of winter cold, allowed the shipment of some meat, but the true commodity was the hide. The industrialization of the process was also tragically visible in the bone trade. After the Great Slaughter, an entirely new industry arose, collecting the bleached bones of the millions of dead bison. These bones were piled into colossal mounds, loaded onto trains and shipped east to be processed into fertilizer, bone meal, and charcoal. This gruesome aftermath ensured that every last element of the bison, even its skeleton, was converted into cash, completing the cycle of annihilation. The combination of the Sharps rifle's precision, the industrial demand for leather, and the efficient logistics of the railroad system transformed the hunter into an industrial worker and the bison herd into raw material. This period of the 1870s was a chilling preview of 20th century industrial agriculture and its devastating environmental cost, illustrating how technology, when coupled with limitless greed, could erase an entire ecosystem in less than a decade.
This policy had 3 devastating effects. Elimination of resistance. By removing the food source, the government stripped the native nations of their economic base and mobility, forcing them into poverty and dependence. A starving tribe could not fight, could not hunt, and could not sustain its nomadic existence. Forced treaty compliance. The destruction of the herds gave the U.S. government immense leverage in treaty negotiations. Starving bands had little choice but to sign treaties ceding huge tracts of land in exchange for meager, often unreliable, federal rations and the confinement of the reservation system. The destruction of the supply chain. The loss of the bison eliminated the Native Americans' ability to trade on their own terms. They could no longer exchange hides for horses, guns, and other necessities, making them completely reliant on corrupt government Indian agents for survival. The official endorsement of the slaughter made the commercial hunter an unofficial, highly effective combatant in the ongoing Indian Wars. The military strategy was chillingly effective. By 1883, the Great Southern Herd was gone. The Northern Herd, which provided the final bastion of indigenous independence, lasted only slightly longer, falling quickly once the hunters moved north and the Canadian government failed to protect them. The government's decision to use ecological destruction as a weapon remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American frontier. For the Plains tribes, the extermination of the bison was not a hardship, it was a cultural apocalypse. The loss was instantaneous, total, and crippling, striking at the very heart of their identity and existence. Loss of economic independence. The bison was the currency of the plains. Without hides, they could not purchase necessary goods like metal tools or rifles. Without pemmican, they could not survive the harsh winters or conduct long hunting trips. The sudden collapse of their primary food supply led to widespread starvation, disease, and desperation. Thousands died not from direct military action, but from famine on the plains and in the initial poorly supplied reservation camps. Destruction of social structure. The bison hunt was the defining male activity, providing social status, honor, and purpose. The sudden cessation of the hunt shattered the traditional warrior and provider roles, leading to deep psychological trauma, alcoholism, and internal social breakdown within the tribes. Chiefs and traditional leaders lost their authority as the people became reliant on the U.S. Indian agent for survival rations. The communal life built around the nomadic movement of the herds crumbled as people were forced to settle in fixed locations. Spiritual erosion. The bison was central to nearly every Plains tribe's spiritual belief system. Rituals like the sun dance and the various ceremonies associated with the hunt were deeply sacred. The sheer desecration of the plains, the rotting carcasses and mountains of bleached bones, was a profound spiritual violation. The loss was a cosmic event, suggesting that the spirit world had abandoned them, or that the power of the white man's magic was irresistible. The despair was absolute. As Chief Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa Lakota observed, a cold wind blew across the prairie when the last buffalo fell, a death wind for my people. The enforced move to the reservation system compounded the cultural loss. Confined to small, often barren tracts of land, dependent on inadequate federal food distributions, and subjected to deliberate assimilation policies, including the forced enrollment of children in boarding schools designed to kill the Indian to save the man, the Plains nations faced a fight not for land, but for the very survival of their identity. The destruction of the bison was the first and most effective step in the total dismantling of the indigenous way of life. The destruction of the bison left the remaining indigenous groups facing an impossible choice: surrender to the reservation or fight a desperate, starving battle against a technologically superior army. The decades that followed the bison's collapse were marked by brief, heroic bursts of resistance, followed by profound cultural retreat. The Northern Conflict. After the southern herd was destroyed, the final campaigns focused on the northern plains. Leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull continued to fight for their nomadic freedom, achieving their final great victory at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. However, even this victory was a temporary reprieve. The subsequent retaliatory military campaigns were unrelenting, and without the bison to sustain them, the large bands were forced to surrender one by one to avoid starvation. Sitting Bull himself was finally forced to bring his band across the border from Canada and surrender in 1881.
The ghost dance. The sheer desperation and trauma caused by the loss of the bison and confinement led to a powerful final spiritual movement, the ghost dance. Prophesied by the Paiute shaman Wovoka, the movement promised that if the people danced and lived righteously, the white man would vanish, the dead would return, and the bison herds would once again roam the plains. It was a religious revival born from absolute despair, a peaceful attempt to spiritually reverse the cultural catastrophe. However, the rapid spread of the ghost dance unnerved the U.S. government and army officials, who saw it as a precursor to armed revolt. This paranoia led directly to the tragic final act of the Indian Wars. The U.S. Army moved to suppress the ghost dance movement, leading to the arrest and death of Sitting Bull in 1890. Days later, on December 29, 1890, the final massacre occurred at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. An estimated 300 Lakota men, women, and children were killed by the 7th Cavalry, ending the last major armed resistance on the Great Plains. The tragedy of Wounded Knee was the bloody, inevitable conclusion to the extermination of the bison, the complete subjugation of a people whose economic and cultural foundation had been utterly destroyed. The near extermination of the bison remains a powerful symbol of ecological devastation and cultural violence in American history. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 wild bison remained in the entire United States, with the last viable herd surviving only within the remote confines of Yellowstone National Park. The great superorganism that had once dominated the plains was a biological remnant, confined to zoos, private collections, and the protected valleys of one national park. The turn to preservation. The finality of the slaughter shocked a small but influential group of conservationists, including former bison hunter William T. Hornaday. Recognizing the imminent extinction, Hornaday and others spearheaded a movement to save the species. They founded the American Bison Society in 1905, often with the support of President Theodore Roosevelt, a devoted conservationist. Through careful breeding and management of the remaining herds in parks and private reserves, the species was slowly pulled back from the brink. The preservation movement, born from the shame of the annihilation, marked the beginning of modern ecological conservation in the United States. Today, the bison population has rebounded to hundreds of thousands, a testament to conservation efforts, although their genetic diversity and vast migratory patterns remain permanently altered.
Cultural and political restoration. For the Plains nations, the cultural loss remains indelible, but the bison has become a powerful symbol of resilience and cultural renewal. Tribes across the plains have actively engaged in bison restoration projects, reintroducing herds onto tribal lands. This effort is not just ecological, it is an act of cultural and economic sovereignty, reconnecting the people with their most sacred animal. The bison's return is viewed as a spiritual healing, an attempt to rebuild the cultural infrastructure that was intentionally destroyed by the U.S. government. The story of the bison is the story of manifest destiny's cost. It illustrates how the ambition for continental dominance, fueled by industrial technology, military policy, and economic greed, obliterated the most powerful natural and cultural elements of the continent. The millions of animals killed were not just wildlife, they were the shield of indigenous sovereignty. Their destruction ensured the rapid, final enclosure of the frontier, paving the way for the cattlemen and homesteaders. The bison's plight defines the violent environmental paradox of American expansion. The nation gained a continent, but lost an irreplaceable piece of its natural and moral heritage. The completion of the Louisiana Purchase and the subsequent victory in the War of 1812 cemented the United States' claim to North America, but it simultaneously inaugurated a century of explicit, organized warfare against the continent's original inhabitants. The conflict, collectively known as the Indian Wars, was not a series of scattered skirmishes. It was a relentless, asymmetrical campaign driven by a single, unwavering national imperative: land acquisition. As the demographic tide of settlers swelled, the federal policy shifted irrevocably from diplomacy and coexistence, often violated, to systematic removal. The architects of this policy, notably President Andrew Jackson, articulated a doctrine that held that the coexistence of independent native nations within the boundaries of American states was impossible. This philosophy disregarded the cultural, economic, and political sovereignty of indigenous groups, viewing them merely as an obstacle to civilization and expansion. Jackson's ideology was enshrined in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which legally authorized the forced exchange of ancestral lands in the Southeast for tracts in the undeveloped West, specifically the region designated as Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. This era set the brutal precedent for all subsequent conflicts. The first major battles were legislative and judicial, not military. The Cherokee Nation, one of the 5 civilized tribes, attempted to use the American legal system to defend their sovereignty, achieving a landmark victory in the Supreme Court case Worcester v. Georgia, 1832. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community and that the laws of Georgia had no force within its boundaries. President Jackson's famously contemptuous reply, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," exposed the hollowness of legal protection when pitted against the ruthless will of the executive branch and the insatiable demand of the settlers. The military enforcement of this political doctrine followed swiftly. The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842 in Florida, became the longest and most costly Indian war in American history, characterized by desperate guerrilla resistance led by the brilliant tactician Osceola. However, the most tragic consequence was the Trail of Tears, 1838, the forced migration of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations from their homelands. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure, a brutal confirmation that the American expansion was predicated on the systematic displacement and dehumanization of indigenous people. While the South was consumed by the crisis of removal, the Old Northwest, the land north of the Ohio River, saw its final definitive struggle for territorial control during the Black Hawk War of 1832. This conflict was a stark illustration of how the relentless pressure of white settlement inevitably provoked a violent confrontation even after decades of treaty negotiation. The Sauk and Fox tribes, led by the elderly yet defiant warrior Black Hawk, had signed treaties ceding their ancestral lands in Illinois and Wisconsin. However, in 1832, facing starvation and the desecration of their sacred sites by encroaching settlers, Black Hawk led a British band of approximately 1,000 Sauk, Fox, and Kickapoo people back across the Mississippi River into their former territory. Black Hawk's intent was likely peaceful, to plant corn and reaffirm his people's cultural claim to the land. But the movement was immediately perceived by the jittery American settlers as an invasion. The resulting conflict was a short, savage affair. The local militia, poorly trained and often panicked, mobilized quickly. The military response included a young volunteer named Abraham Lincoln and a young lieutenant named Jefferson Davis, ironically placing 2 future leaders of the Civil War on the same side of the Western conquest. Black Hawk's band, burdened by non-combatants, was relentlessly pursued north toward the Wisconsin River. The war culminated in the devastating Battle of Wisconsin Heights and finally the Bad Axe Massacre at the confluence of the Bad Axe River and the Mississippi. As Black Hawk's people attempted to cross the Mississippi to reach safer territory, they were trapped and slaughtered by the U.S. Army and its militia allies. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed as they attempted to swim to safety. The Bad Axe Massacre was less a battle and more a systematic execution of a desperate retreating group. The Black Hawk War secured the American claim to the entire Old Northwest, opening Illinois and Wisconsin for mass settlement and extinguishing the final vestiges of native armed resistance east of the Mississippi. Black Hawk himself was captured and later toured as a curiosity in the East. His final plea, "What river is that?" We have been across it before, when the Indian was the owner of the country, and he crossed as he pleased, echoed the sorrowful acknowledgment that the American expansion had eliminated indigenous freedom of movement and territorial sovereignty. The American victory in the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, brought immense new territory, the vast arid lands of the Southwest, including modern New Mexico, Arizona, and California. This acquisition did not bring peace, it merely transferred the existing centuries-old conflicts between native nations and European settlers, now Americans, into the jurisdiction of the United States. Here, the Indian Wars took on a new, protracted, and brutal form of guerrilla warfare against the masters of the desert, the Navajo, and the various bands of the Apache.
The conflict in the Southwest was defined by the harsh, broken terrain, canyons, high plateaus, and relentless deserts, which favored highly mobile, decentralized resistance. The Apache bands, in particular, were decentralized, politically autonomous, and brilliant horsemen and raiders. For centuries, Apache and Navajo bands had engaged in cycles of raiding and warfare with Spanish and Mexican settlements, primarily for livestock and captives. When the Americans arrived, they immediately demanded an end to these traditional economic activities, viewing the raids as criminal acts against American sovereignty. The Navajo, skilled agriculturalists and weavers, attempted to adapt to the new regime, signing treaties that were quickly violated by American settlers and the military. The constant cycle of raid, retaliation, and broken promises led the U.S. military to pursue a devastating total war strategy. In 1863-1864, under the direction of General James Carleton, Colonel Kit Carson led a campaign of absolute destruction against the Navajo. Carson's troops burned crops, destroyed hogans, traditional homes, and slaughtered livestock in the Navajo heartland of Canyon de Chelly. This scorched earth strategy forced the surrender of thousands of starving Navajo. The surrender led to the tragic Long Walk of the Navajo, 1864, a forced march of over 300 miles to the inhospitable reservation at Bosque Redondo, New Mexico. Hundreds died during the march and years of confinement due to disease and malnutrition. The American military policy here was clear. The complete dismantling of a civilization's physical and economic base was deemed necessary to achieve permanent subjugation. The Long Walk served as the Southwest's painful equivalent of the Trail of Tears. The escalating conflicts on the Great Plains in the 1860s transformed the nature of the Indian Wars from military operations against warriors into deliberate attacks on civilian populations. The catalyst for this devastating shift was the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Tensions in the Colorado Territory were already dangerously high due to the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, which flooded Cheyenne and Arapaho lands with miners and settlers. Many bands seeking peace gathered near Fort Lyon under the protection of the U.S. Army, led by Chiefs Black Kettle and White Antelope. They believed they were under a flag of truce, camping peacefully at Sand Creek. On November 29, 1864, a force of over 700 Colorado Territory militia, led by Colonel John Chivington, descended upon the unsuspecting camp. Chivington, a fervent expansionist, declared his intent was to kill and scalp all, big and little. Despite the presence of American flags and white flags of surrender, the militia attacked, slaughtering an estimated 150 to 200 Native Americans, most of whom were women, children, and the elderly. The troops mutilated the bodies with shocking brutality. The Sand Creek Massacre sent shockwaves through the plains. It destroyed any remaining faith in the U.S. government's treaties or promises of protection. Where many chiefs had previously advocated for peace and accommodation, Sand Creek served as a brutal lesson. Assimilation or surrender was not a guarantee of life. It immediately provoked widespread retaliation by the Cheyenne and Sioux, who launched devastating raids across the Kansas and Nebraska plains, igniting a decade of intense, all-out warfare aimed at driving settlers out of their hunting grounds. The massacre made clear that the U.S. military, in its zeal to secure the frontier, was prepared to engage in a policy of total war against entire indigenous communities. The age of compromise was over.
In the decade following the Civil War, the Sioux Nation, particularly the Lakota, Teton Sioux bands, emerged as the most formidable resistance force on the northern plains. Their struggle centered on control of the Bozeman Trail, a critical overland route built in 1864 to ferry miners and settlers from the Oregon Trail north to the newly discovered goldfields of Montana. The trail cut directly through the Powder River country, the last great hunting ground of the Lakota and Cheyenne, a violation of previous treaties that the tribes viewed as an existential threat. The resulting conflict, known as Red Cloud's War, 1866-1868, was a rare and spectacular military success for indigenous forces. The primary leader was Red Cloud, a brilliant Oglala Lakota strategist who refused to meet the Americans in large-scale set-piece battles. Instead, he employed a sophisticated, years-long strategy of siege and harassment. He effectively blockaded the Bozeman Trail by surrounding and constantly attacking the U.S. Army forts established to protect it, namely Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith. The U.S. soldiers were trapped, forced to constantly fight for survival, and unable to keep the trail open. The military humiliation culminated in the Fetterman fight on December 21, 1866. A Lakota and Cheyenne decoy party, including warriors like Crazy Horse, lured Captain William J. Fetterman and 80 of his men into an ambush near Fort Phil Kearny. Fetterman, who famously boasted he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men, was swiftly surrounded and wiped out. Not a single American soldier survived. The sheer audacity and effectiveness of the ambush sent shockwaves through the U.S. military command. Red Cloud's success forced the U.S. government, for one of the few times in the history of the Indian Wars, to negotiate peace under duress. The subsequent Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, granted the Lakota a vast, permanent reservation, including the sacred Black Hills, Pahasapa, and crucially, mandated that the U.S. Army abandon and dismantle its forts along the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud refused to sign the treaty until he saw the forts burned to the ground. This treaty was a moment of true indigenous triumph, demonstrating that unified resistance combined with strategic brilliance could force the retreat of the American military. However, this peace would prove agonizingly short-lived. The fragile peace established by Red Cloud in 1868 was shattered by the same reoccurring factor: gold. The Treaty of Fort Laramie had explicitly guaranteed the Lakota exclusive and absolute ownership of the Black Hills, stating that no white person would ever be permitted to settle or trespass there. However, the American appetite for mineral wealth proved stronger than any solemn oath. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer, leading the 7th Cavalry, conducted an exploratory expedition into the Black Hills, a brazen violation of the treaty. Custer immediately reported the presence of gold from the grassroots down, triggering a massive illegal influx of miners and settlers onto the sacred Lakota land. The U.S. government, facing immense political pressure, did nothing to stop the trespassers. When the Lakota and Cheyenne justly responded by defending their treaty-guaranteed territory, the government declared them hostiles and ordered the army to round them up and force them onto smaller reservations.
This declaration initiated the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877. The Lakota and Cheyenne, led by the spiritual and political authority of Sitting Bull and the brilliant tactical leadership of Crazy Horse, refused to be confined. They gathered in the largest concentration of Plains warriors ever assembled, demonstrating a unified will to fight for their sacred land and way of life. The conflict culminated on June 25, 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Montana. Custer, arrogant and determined to achieve a decisive victory for his own political glory, foolishly divided his regiment and launched a premature attack on the massive encampment. The combined Lakota and Cheyenne forces, led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and others, overwhelmed and annihilated Custer and all 210 men under his direct command. Custer's last stand was a stunning, symbolic victory, the high-water mark of Native American military resistance against the U.S. Army.
However, the victory was a military anomaly, not a strategic turning point. The public outrage in the East was overwhelming, leading to a massive military campaign of vengeance and subjugation. The U.S. government abandoned any pretense of negotiation, sending thousands of troops to relentlessly pursue the scattered native bands throughout the winter. Unable to sustain their large groups without the Bison, which had been systematically exterminated, the Sioux and Cheyenne were slowly and relentlessly starved into submission. Sitting Bull was eventually forced to flee to Canada before surrendering in 1881. Crazy Horse was killed later that year after surrendering. Little Bighorn was the last great battle, but it sealed the fate of the Plains tribes. The tragedy of the Indian Wars was perhaps nowhere more poignantly displayed than in the campaign against the Nez Perce people of the Pacific Northwest. Their resistance was led by Chief Joseph, a non-Christian chief renowned for his eloquence and strategic wisdom. The Nez Perce, who inhabited the Wallowa Valley in Oregon, had signed an 1855 treaty guaranteeing them a large reservation. However, the discovery of gold led to a unilateral imposition of a new treaty in 1863, drastically reducing their land. Chief Joseph and the non-treaty bands refused to cede their ancestral homeland. Under the threat of military invasion in 1877, Joseph reluctantly agreed to move his people peacefully to the reservation. However, a sudden raid by some young warriors on nearby white settlements forced Joseph to abandon the move and commence a desperate 1,170-mile flight for freedom. Their goal was political asylum in Canada, where Sitting Bull had found temporary refuge. The ensuing 4-month campaign was a masterpiece of retreat. Joseph, leading a band of approximately 750 people, only 200 of whom were fighting men, successfully outmaneuvered and defeated or fought to a standstill 4 separate U.S. Army columns under Generals Oliver O. Howard and Nelson A. Miles. The Nez Perce demonstrated incredible discipline, empathy, often refusing to attack non-combatants, and tactical genius, utilizing the rugged terrain of the Bitterroot Mountains and Yellowstone National Park to their advantage. They became an international symbol of courageous resistance. The chase ended just 40 miles from the Canadian border in Montana, where the exhausted, freezing, and starving Nez Perce were surrounded after a 5-day siege. Chief Joseph, seeing his people freezing and without food, delivered his famous speech of surrender. "Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Despite promises of being returned to their Oregon homeland, the Nez Perce were instead exiled to the unhealthy Indian Territory, where hundreds more died. Joseph's march was not a military victory for the Nez Perce, but it became a profound moral and ethical indictment of the American policy of dispossession. While the Northern Plains Wars were fought with massed cavalry charges, the final conflicts in the Southwest were defined by relentless tracking, endurance, and the implacable will of one man, Geronimo. Geronimo, born Goyakla, was a Chiricahua Apache medicine man and warrior whose decades-long resistance became legendary. The Apache Wars, particularly the struggle of Geronimo's small band, were the last flickering flame of armed native independence. The Chiricahua Apache were masters of the harsh, arid terrain straddling the U.S.-Mexican border. Their war was a cycle of raiding and retreating, using the border as a sanctuary to evade American and Mexican forces. Geronimo's personal war was fueled by deep grievance. Mexican troops had killed his family in 1851. His resistance was not about establishing a territory, but about maintaining the freedom of his small band and exacting retribution against those who invaded their land. The U.S. Army's campaign against Geronimo in the 1880s was an immense, expensive logistical operation. It required thousands of troops, led by the seasoned General George Crook and later General Nelson A. Miles, to pursue a band that rarely numbered more than 50 men, women, and children. The Army employed sophisticated tracking techniques, using Apache scouts against their own people, and pioneering the use of the heliograph, a sun-flashing telegraph system, to coordinate movements across the vast desert distances. The final pursuit involved 5,000 U.S. soldiers, nearly a quarter of the entire U.S. Army, hunting fewer than 40 Apache individuals. This lopsided force ratio underscored the government's absolute determination to crush even the smallest pocket of resistance. Geronimo finally surrendered for the last time in September 1886. The terms of his surrender were broken. Instead of being allowed to return to their homeland, Geronimo and his entire band, including the Apache scouts who had helped track him, were exiled to prison in Florida and then Oklahoma. Geronimo's capture effectively marked the symbolic end of the Indian Wars in the Southwest. His capture symbolized the final military triumph of American technological and manpower superiority over the freedom of the individual warrior. The official end of the Indian Wars came not with a great battle, but with a spiritual movement and a massacre. By the late 1880s, the Plains tribes were defeated, confined to reservations, starving, and subjected to relentless assimilation policies. Their cultural and economic foundation, the Bison, was gone. This
declaration initiated the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877. The Lakota and Cheyenne, led by the spiritual and political authority of Sitting Bull and the brilliant tactical leadership of Crazy Horse, refused to be confined. They gathered in the largest concentration of Plains warriors ever assembled, demonstrating a unified will to fight for their sacred land and way of life. The conflict culminated on June 25, 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Montana. Custer, arrogant and determined to achieve a decisive victory for his own political glory, foolishly divided his regiment and launched a premature attack on the massive encampment. The combined Lakota and Cheyenne forces, led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and others, overwhelmed and annihilated Custer and all 210 men under his direct command. Custer's last stand was a stunning symbolic victory, the high watermark of Native American military resistance against the U.S. Army. However, the victory was a military anomaly, not a strategic turning point. The public outrage in the East was overwhelming, leading to a massive military campaign of vengeance and subjugation. The U.S. government abandoned any pretense of negotiation, sending thousands of troops to relentlessly pursue the scattered native bands throughout the winter. Unable to sustain their large groups without the Bison, which had been systematically exterminated, the Sioux and Cheyenne were slowly and relentlessly starved into submission. Sitting Bull was eventually forced to flee to Canada before surrendering in 1881. Crazy Horse was killed later that year after surrendering. Little Bighorn was the last great battle, but it sealed the fate of the Plains tribes. The tragedy of the Indian Wars was perhaps nowhere more poignantly displayed than in the campaign against the Nez Perce people of the Pacific Northwest. Their resistance was led by Chief Joseph, a non-Christian chief renowned for his eloquence and strategic wisdom. The Nez Perce, who inhabited the Wallowa Valley in Oregon, had signed an 1855 treaty guaranteeing them a large reservation. However, the discovery of gold led to the unilateral imposition of a new treaty in 1863, drastically reducing their land. Chief Joseph and the non-treaty bands refused to cede their ancestral homeland. Under the threat of military invasion in 1877, Joseph reluctantly agreed to move his people peacefully to the reservation. However, a sudden raid by some young warriors on nearby white settlements
forced Joseph to abandon the move and commence a desperate 1,170-mile flight for freedom. Their goal was political asylum in Canada, where Sitting Bull had found temporary refuge. The ensuing 4-month campaign was a military masterpiece of retreat.
A few months before the massacre, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was officially closed. The era of the Indian Wars ended, not because the native nations ceased to resist, but because the resources and the land that fueled their resistance had been systematically enclosed, depopulated, and conquered. The century of warfare had secured the continent for the United States, but at the cost of countless lives and the systematic erasure of sovereign native nations. The resistance had failed militarily, giving way to the long, difficult period of cultural survival and political activism that would define the 20th century. The smoke of Wounded Knee had barely cleared when the American government, satisfied with the military subjugation of the frontier, declared the Indian Wars officially over. Yet for the indigenous nations, the war simply shifted terrain. The era of the cavalry charge and the open battlefield gave way to the far more insidious, protracted conflict waged through federal policy and cultural erasure. This new strategy, executed by the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, was known euphemistically as the peace policy, or the program of assimilation. The goal was no longer extermination, but transformation, to dismantle the tribal structure, destroy indigenous identity, and remake Native Americans into self-sufficient, land-owning Christian farmers. In short, to civilize them in the image of the white American settler. The phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man," became the unofficial, brutal motto of this era. This shift was a calculated maneuver. The immense cost and political unpopularity of perpetual military conflict demanded a more orderly, cost-effective solution for securing Western land. The land, which was still federally held and often tribal property under treaty, could only be acquired for white settlement if the native populations were neutralized politically and culturally. Assimilation was, therefore, an administrative prelude to land theft. The policy relied on the assumption that indigenous cultures were inherently inferior and doomed to extinction, justifying the federal government's paternalistic and dictatorial control over all aspects of native life. The architects of assimilation viewed the 3 pillars of native identity: communal landholding, nomadic freedom, and traditional religion and language as the primary obstacles to progress. The new policy aimed to systematically destroy these pillars by confining the people to geographically and culturally isolated reservations, placing them under the complete authority of often corrupt Indian agents, and enacting laws designed to fracture families and erase spiritual beliefs. The reservation became a laboratory for social engineering, a state-controlled environment where every element of indigenous life was dictated, scrutinized, and forcibly replaced by Anglo-American norms. The long, difficult 20th century was thus launched, defined by the psychological and material damage inflicted by this systematic assault on sovereignty and culture. The reservation system was the physical foundation upon which the assimilation policy was built. Its function was threefold: containment, control, and land acquisition. The government established reservations primarily through treaties that were often signed under duress, coercion, or outright deception, usually after military defeat or near starvation forced capitulation. These tracts of land were typically the least desirable, remote, arid, and unsuitable for the very agriculture the BIA insisted the native populations adopt. The process of confinement shattered the core economic and cultural structure of most Plains and Western tribes. Nomadic peoples, whose identity was intrinsically linked to vast spaces and the seasonal pursuit of the buffalo, were suddenly locked onto small, permanent territories. The psychological trauma of this forced stillness was immense, likened by some to a spiritual death. Mobility, the essence of their freedom, was replaced by physical imprisonment. Furthermore, the reservation system intentionally mixed rival tribes onto a single tract of land, or conversely, divided closely related bands onto separate, non-contiguous reservations, effectively creating internal social friction and disrupting long-established political cohesion. The reservations were administered by the Indian agent, a political appointee often lacking experience, cultural sensitivity, and sometimes even basic literacy. The agent wielded absolute, unchecked power, functioning as judge, jury, police chief, and economic director. He controlled the issuance of essential rations, food, blankets, tools, the distribution of which became the ultimate tool of control. Obedience to the agent's directives meant survival. Disobedience meant starvation. This system fostered dependency, as the government had intentionally destroyed the indigenous economic base, the Bison, to ensure that native populations were utterly reliant on federal handouts. The reservation was not a protected sanctuary. It was a carefully managed institution of control, designed to strip away economic autonomy and political self-governance, reducing formerly sovereign nations to the status of wards of the state, minors under the absolute guardianship of the U.S. government. The reservation system was plagued from its inception by rampant corruption and administrative incompetence, transforming federal aid into a tool of deprivation and suffering. President Ulysses S. Grant attempted to reform the system through his peace policy, assigning control of many agencies to various Christian denominations: Quakers, Methodists, Catholics. The idea was that religious devotion would ensure integrity, but in reality it merely replaced political cronyism with sectarian control and often deep-seated religious prejudice. The church-appointed agents, though sometimes sincere, often viewed their role as a missionary project, prioritizing forced conversion over material well-being. Whether appointed for political gain or religious conviction, the typical Indian agent controlled every aspect of the tribe's limited resources. The rations, meager allotments of flour, rancid bacon, coffee, and sugar, were often insufficient and frequently spoiled. Systemic corruption meant that agents, suppliers, and contractors routinely skimmed profits, substituting promised goods with cheaper, inferior products. Wagons intended to be filled with quality blankets arrived with threadbare cloth. Promised beef was often underweight or diseased. For the native populations, this corruption meant constant malnutrition, rampant disease, tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza, and the psychological torture of relying on unreliable, often contemptuous government officials for their daily bread. The agent used the distribution of these rations to enforce cultural compliance. Men who cut their long hair, women who wore Western dresses, or individuals who converted to Christianity received favorable treatment. Those who resisted, who continued traditional ceremonies or taught their native language, found their rations reduced or withheld entirely. The agent became the visible face of the American government's tyranny, a gatekeeper who held the keys to life and death. This cyclical dependency and corruption created an economic trap. Native peoples were denied the tools and fertile land to farm successfully, forcing them to rely on government handouts, which in turn perpetuated the stereotype of the lazy Indian and justified further federal control and land seizures. The assimilation policy launched a direct, deliberate war against the external markers of indigenous identity. This was an attempt to erase the outward appearance of the Indian and enforce the external conformity of the civilized man. The BIA issued specific regulations designed to dismantle traditional culture. Language ban. Speaking native languages, the vessel of tradition, law, and spiritual knowledge, was strictly forbidden in schools and on government property. Children were punished, often brutally, for speaking their mother tongue. The goal was to sever the generational chain of memory. Dress code.
Traditional clothing, leather, and blankets were replaced by cheaply manufactured, ill-fitting Western garments. For Plains warriors, the most painful requirement was the forced cutting of their long, sacred hair, a symbolic act of mourning and loss of masculine status and power. Banning of ceremonies. Traditional religious practices were viewed as pagan and subversive. The sun dance, the ghost dance, and other communal ceremonies were outlawed, often enforced by reservation police or BIA troops. Any communal gathering was viewed with suspicion and often violently suppressed, as fear of renewed resistance lingered after events like Wounded Knee. Renaming and fragmentation. Indigenous names, which often carried deep spiritual and familial significance, were replaced with generic English names. Chief Joseph became Joseph. Furthermore, traditional kinship ties were attacked. Polygamy, which was a common practice in some tribes, was outlawed, forcing the breakup of families and attempting to impose the Victorian nuclear family model.
A few months before the massacre, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was officially closed. The era of the Indian Wars ended, not because the native nations ceased to resist, but because the resources and the land that fueled their resistance had been systematically enclosed, depopulated, and conquered. The century of warfare had secured the continent for the United States, but at the cost of countless lives and the systematic erasure of sovereign native nations. The resistance had failed militarily, giving way to the long, difficult period of cultural survival and political activism that would define the 20th century. The smoke of Wounded Knee had barely cleared when the American government, satisfied with the military subjugation of the frontier, declared the Indian Wars officially over. Yet for the indigenous nations, the war simply shifted terrain. The era of the cavalry charge and the open battlefield gave way to the far more insidious, protracted conflict waged through federal policy and cultural erasure. This new strategy, executed by the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, was known euphemistically as the peace policy, or the program of assimilation. The goal was no longer extermination, but transformation, to dismantle the tribal structure, destroy indigenous identity, and remake Native Americans into self-sufficient, land-owning Christian farmers. In short, to civilize them in the image of the white American settler. The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," became the unofficial, brutal motto of this era. This shift was a calculated maneuver. The immense cost and political unpopularity of perpetual military conflict demanded a more orderly, cost-effective solution for securing Western land. The land, which was still federally held and often tribal property under treaty, could only be acquired for white settlement if the native populations were neutralized politically and culturally. Assimilation was, therefore, an administrative prelude to land theft. The policy relied on the assumption that indigenous cultures were inherently inferior and doomed to extinction, justifying the federal government's paternalistic and dictatorial control over all aspects of native life. The architects of assimilation viewed the three pillars of native identity: communal landholding, nomadic freedom, and traditional religion and language as the primary obstacles to progress. The new policy aimed to systematically destroy these pillars by confining the people to geographically and culturally isolated reservations, placing them under the complete authority of often corrupt Indian agents, and enacting laws designed to fracture families and erase spiritual beliefs. The reservation became a laboratory for social engineering, a state-controlled environment where every element of indigenous life was dictated, scrutinized, and forcibly replaced by Anglo-American norms. The long, difficult 20th century was thus launched, defined by the psychological and material damage inflicted by this systematic assault on sovereignty and culture. The reservation system was the physical foundation upon which the assimilation policy was built. Its function was threefold: containment, control, and land acquisition. The government established reservations primarily through treaties that were often signed under duress, coercion, or outright deception, usually after military defeat or near starvation forced capitulation. These tracts of land were typically the least desirable, remote, arid, and unsuitable for the very agriculture the BIA insisted the native populations adopt. The process of confinement shattered the core economic and cultural structure of most Plains and Western tribes. Nomadic peoples, whose identity was intrinsically linked to vast spaces and the seasonal pursuit of the buffalo, were suddenly locked onto small, permanent territories. The psychological trauma of this forced stillness was immense, likened by some to a spiritual death. Mobility, the essence of their freedom, was replaced by physical imprisonment. Furthermore, the reservation system intentionally mixed rival tribes onto a single tract of land, or conversely, divided closely related bands onto separate, non-contiguous reservations, effectively creating internal social friction and disrupting long-established political cohesion. The reservations were administered by the Indian agent, a political appointee often lacking experience, cultural sensitivity, and sometimes even basic literacy. The agent wielded absolute, unchecked power, functioning as judge, jury, police chief, and economic director. He controlled the issuance of essential rations, food, blankets, tools, the distribution of which became the ultimate tool of control. Obedience to the agent's directives meant survival. Disobedience meant starvation. This system fostered dependency, as the government had intentionally destroyed the indigenous economic base, the Bison, to ensure that native populations were utterly reliant on federal handouts. The reservation was not a protected sanctuary. It was a carefully managed institution of control, designed to strip away economic autonomy and political self-governance, reducing formerly sovereign nations to the status of wards of the state, minors under the absolute guardianship of the U.S. government. The reservation system was plagued from its inception by rampant corruption and administrative incompetence, transforming federal aid into a tool of deprivation and suffering. President Ulysses S. Grant attempted to reform the system through his peace policy, assigning control of many agencies to various Christian denominations: Quakers, Methodists, Catholics. The idea was that religious devotion would ensure integrity, but in reality it merely replaced political cronyism with sectarian control and often deep-seated religious prejudice. The church-appointed agents, though sometimes sincere, often viewed their role as a missionary project, prioritizing forced conversion over material well-being. Whether appointed for political gain or religious conviction, the typical Indian agent controlled every aspect of the tribe's limited resources. The rations, meager allotments of flour, rancid bacon, coffee, and sugar, were often insufficient and frequently spoiled. Systemic corruption meant that agents, suppliers, and contractors routinely skimmed profits, substituting promised goods with cheaper, inferior products. Wagons intended to be filled with quality blankets arrived with threadbare cloth. Promised beef was often underweight or diseased. For the native populations, this corruption meant constant malnutrition, rampant disease, tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza, and the psychological torture of relying on unreliable, often contemptuous government officials for their daily bread. The agent used the distribution of these rations to enforce cultural compliance. Men who cut their long hair, women who wore Western dresses, or individuals who converted to Christianity received favorable treatment. Those who resisted, who continued traditional ceremonies or taught their native language, found their rations reduced or withheld entirely. The agent became the visible face of the American government's tyranny, a gatekeeper who held the keys to life and death. This cyclical dependency and corruption created an economic trap. Native peoples were denied the tools and fertile land to farm successfully, forcing them to rely on government handouts, which in turn perpetuated the stereotype of the lazy Indian and justified further federal control and land seizures. The assimilation policy launched a direct, deliberate war against the external markers of indigenous identity. This was an attempt to erase the outward appearance of the Indian and enforce the external conformity of the civilized man. The BIA issued specific regulations designed to dismantle traditional culture. Language ban. Speaking native languages, the vessel of tradition, law, and spiritual knowledge, was strictly forbidden in schools and on government property. Children were punished, often brutally, for speaking their mother tongue. The goal was to sever the generational chain of memory. Dress code. Traditional clothing, leather, and blankets were replaced by cheaply manufactured, ill-fitting Western garments. For Plains warriors, the most painful requirement was the forced cutting of their long, sacred hair, a symbolic act of mourning and loss of masculine status and power. Banning of ceremonies. Traditional religious practices were viewed as pagan and subversive. The sun dance, the ghost dance, and other communal ceremonies were outlawed, often enforced by reservation police or BIA troops. Any communal gathering was viewed with suspicion and often violently suppressed, as fear of renewed resistance lingered after events like Wounded Knee. Renaming and fragmentation. Indigenous names, which often carried deep spiritual and familial significance, were replaced with generic English names. Chief Joseph became Joseph. Furthermore, traditional kinship ties were attacked. Polygamy, which was a common practice in some tribes, was outlawed, forcing the breakup of families and attempting to impose the Victorian nuclear family model.
Native peoples developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining tradition beneath the veneer of BIA compliance. Ceremonies were moved underground, often performed in secret locations, were disguised as acceptable Christian practices. The peyote religion, later formalized as the Native American Church, emerged as a powerful syncretic spiritual movement that fused Christian ethics with traditional Native ritual, offering spiritual solace and community in a time of overwhelming despair. This movement was vital because it was decentralized and therefore impossible for the BIA to completely eradicate. Furthermore, language and kinship ties were preserved by the elders. While children learned English in the schools, they were often taught their native language and tribal histories secretly during visits home or through informal gatherings outside the agent's watch. The extended family, the kinship network, remained the true unit of survival, sharing the few resources they possessed and providing the psychological buffer against institutional abuse. The knowledge of medicinal herbs, traditional arts, and oral histories became sacred secrets, passed down through whispers and guarded fiercely. The boarding school system, intended to fracture tribal bonds, paradoxically created pan-Indian identity. Students from different nations, united by shared trauma, learned to view themselves not just as Lakota or Navajo, but as Native American, laying the intellectual and political groundwork for the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century. The failure of assimilation was ultimately a failure of imagination. The American government could conquer the land and control the bodies of Native peoples, but it could not extinguish the memory, the spirit, or the deep, enduring cultural connection to the land that defined their identity. By the close of the 19th century, the era of civilizing the Indian had achieved its immediate political goals. The American frontier was secured, the land was open to settlement, and the indigenous populations were militarily and economically subdued. However, the policies of assimilation left behind a long, dark legacy of trauma, institutionalized poverty, and political dependency that would define the next century. The primary legacy was the dispossession of the land base, the catastrophic loss of tribal lands through the Dawes Act,
which permanently crippled tribal nations' ability to achieve economic self-sufficiency. The psychological wounds of the boarding school era, the stolen generation, separated from language and family, created an intergenerational trauma that continues to be addressed today. The reservation system cemented a relationship of dependency on the federal government, which continues to struggle with its treaty obligations to provide health care, education, and infrastructure. The failure of the assimilation policy was finally and officially acknowledged in the 1930s with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This act reversed the disastrous Dawes policy, recognized the principle of self-governance, and halted the transfer of land to non-native ownership. The IRA marked the beginning of a halting, decades-long process of self-determination. The true end of the Indian Wars, therefore, was not Wounded Knee in 1890, but the realization that cultural survival was the ultimate victory. The 20th century became the era of political, legal, and spiritual resurgence, the battle for civil rights, the fight for treaty recognition, and the powerful emergence of Native American political activism demanding the restoration of sovereignty and the right to self-determination. The story of the reservation and assimilation is the tragic yet inspiring history of a people who were attacked at the root of their identity, yet found the tenacity to survive and eventually thrive, turning a policy of forced erasure into a future of cultural resilience and political action. The narrative of American expansion, once defined by boundless space and endless opportunity, slammed into a hard statistical wall in 1890. That year, the U.S. Census Bureau issued a terse, bureaucratic statement that resonated like a thunderclap across the Republic. Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present, the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. With those dry official words, the geographical engine that had driven American identity for nearly 3 centuries sputtered to a halt. The frontier, a continuous, moving edge of civilization pushing into the wilderness, was declared officially closed. This declaration created an immediate and profound identity crisis. For generations, the West had been the nation's safety valve, the promise of reinvention, the proving ground for democracy. It was the space that supposedly defined American exceptionalism, shaping the national character as self-reliant, innovative, and democratic. What happens to a people whose defining mythology vanishes overnight? The closing of the frontier signaled the end of an era of virtually free, accessible land and initiated a difficult transition from a philosophy of boundless possibility to a realization of finite resources and limits. The final frontier was not a continuous belt of lush land. It was a patchwork of territories the settlers had skipped over: the arid high plains between the 98th meridian and the Rockies, the rugged Intermountain West, and the lands explicitly reserved for Native American nations. The final act of settlement required the federal government to use increasingly aggressive legal and infrastructural tools, not just wagon trains, but congressional decrees, massive irrigation projects, corporate mining consolidation, and the final forced dispossession of the last native-held lands. The settler of this final era was less a solitary pioneer and more a participant in a vast, federally managed project. The chaotic, individualistic conquest was over. The systematic, organized enclosure had begun. The closing of the frontier thus forced America to look inward, confronting the social, economic, and racial conflicts that could no longer be exported west. The most dramatic and symbolically final act of settlement occurred in the region known as Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Established as the definitive repository for the removed eastern tribes, Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, etc., the territory was intended to be a permanent, sovereign sanctuary.
However, by the 1880s, the irresistible pressure of manifest destiny and the end of the open range targeted this final reserve of unassigned land. The land fever reached its peak in 1889. Despite solemn treaties, Congress authorized the settlement of 2 million acres of prime, federally held land within the territory. The method chosen for the distribution was unprecedented and chaotic: the land run. On April 22, 1889, at precisely noon, a gunshot signaled the start of a mass race. Tens of thousands of land-hungry settlers, men, women, and families, lined up at the border, ready to dash, ride, and push into the unassigned lands to stake their 160-acre claims. The spectacle was a terrifying, exhilarating display of individualistic greed and national urgency. The race was chaotic and marked by outright fraud. Many individuals, known as Sooners, sneaked into the territory ahead of the official start time, hiding in gullies and thickets to claim the best plots near water and transportation hubs. Their cheating undermined the entire process, yet the government often legalized the fraudulent claims to maintain order. In a single day, towns like Guthrie and Oklahoma City exploded from empty prairie into instant metropolises of 10,000 people, marked by temporary tent cities, raw commercial energy, and immediate lawlessness.
However, the most persistent threat to the Union Pacific was military. The route traversed the traditional hunting grounds of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, who viewed the railroad as an existential invasion of their territory. The railroad was a physical breach of treaties and a harbinger of the end of the buffalo herds that sustained their way of life. Native American raids on surveying teams, construction camps, and supply lines were frequent and often devastating. The UP was forced to operate in a constant state of armed alert. Many of the workers were veterans, and the construction crews were often protected by military escorts led by generals who were fresh from the Civil War. The building of the Union Pacific was, in effect, a military operation that permanently secured the Central Plains for American settlement, ensuring that the Iron Horse would serve as the ultimate instrument of manifest destiny and indigenous displacement. The monumental achievement of the Transcontinental Railroad was tragically overshadowed by one of the largest financial and political corruption scandals in U.S. history, the Credit Mobilier scandal. This scandal laid bare the exploitative financial structure that underpinned the entire project, revealing that the true fortunes were made not by building the rail, but by exploiting the generous federal subsidies. As established by Oakes and Oliver Ames, Credit Mobilier was the construction company hired by the Union Pacific. The UP directors, however, secretly controlled Credit Mobilier. This allowed them to award construction contracts to themselves at ridiculously inflated prices, ensuring massive personal profits that dwarfed the actual cost of construction. For example, a mile of track that might cost $30,000 to build was contracted to Credit Mobilier for $70,000, with the difference being pocketed by the Ames brothers and their associates. The critical stage of the corruption involved insulating the scheme from government oversight. Oakes Ames, acting as a congressman, shrewdly distributed stock in Credit Mobilier to dozens of influential U.S. congressmen, senators, and even Vice President Schuyler Colfax. These shares were sold far below their actual value, a thinly disguised form of bribery designed to buy silence and political protection from any investigation. The politicians, now financially implicated, ensured that federal oversight was minimal and that the flow of subsidies remained constant. The scandal erupted publicly in 1872 during the presidential election campaign, revealing a staggering breach of public trust. While several key political figures were censured or implicated, very few faced legal consequences. The Credit Mobilier scandal demonstrated a fundamental truth about the Gilded Age West. The massive projects of national progress were often vehicles for private enrichment and political graft. The federal government,
eager for the symbolic completion of the railway, had essentially written a blank check to a few corporate insiders, costing American taxpayers tens of millions of dollars and permanently tarnishing the reputation of the first Transcontinental Railroad. The final phase of the railroad was a frantic, almost absurd race, driven entirely by the increasing value of the federal subsidies and land grants. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific were laying tracks toward an unknown meeting point, maximizing mileage to collect the most bonds and land. The rivalry was fierce, crossing all lines of corporate and national pride. In the final months of 1868 and early 1869, the competition escalated to ridiculous extremes. The companies began building grade lines parallel to each other for hundreds of miles across the Utah desert, competing for the right-of-way that was yet to be finalized by Congress. This meant that two grading crews were literally working side by side, moving earth and rock, sometimes even resorting to sabotage and physical fights, all to claim mileage that only one company would be paid for. Congress finally intervened, selecting Promontory Summit, Utah, north of the Great Salt Lake, as the final meeting point. The ceremony on May 10, 1869, was designed to be the ultimate triumph of national unity and engineering prowess. The Union Pacific's locomotive number 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter pulled their trains nose to nose on the single track. Dignitaries, workers, and military personnel gathered to witness the driving of the Golden Spike, the last spike. The climax was broadcast live across the nation, not through audio, but through telegraph. A wire was run from the last spike directly to the telegraph key. As Leland Stanford, the CP president, raised his silver maul, Oaks Ames was notably absent due to the credit Mobilier scandal, the sound of the maul striking the spike was wired live to San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C. When the final tap was sent, bells rang in Philadelphia, 100 guns fired in New York, and the nation erupted in celebration. The continent was finally connected. The physical separation of the East and West, which had defined American life for 2 centuries, ended in a flash of telegraphic light and the symbolic tap of a gilded spike. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad was more than an engineering achievement. It was the single most powerful engine of American continental transformation, permanently reshaping the nation's economy, demography, and geopolitical outlook. Economic revolution. The journey from coast to coast, which once took months, was reduced to about 7 days. This dramatic reduction in transit time and cost immediately opened up the vast resources of the West, timber, cattle, silver, and gold, to the industrial markets of the East. It enabled Eastern manufactured goods to flood the Western markets, creating a unified national economy based on mass production and rapid distribution. New economic centers, from Denver to Seattle, were born or radically expanded along the rail lines.
Accelerated settlement and the end of indigenous sovereignty. The railroad created a permanent and irresistible path for massive waves of settlers. The vast federal land grants not only financed the railroad, but were actively sold by the companies to attract new farmers, miners, and towns. This influx of population proved immediately catastrophic for the remaining indigenous nations. The railroad facilitated the rapid deployment of the U.S. Army, shattered tribal hunting grounds, and, most crucially, was directly responsible for the systematic slaughter of the American bison, buffalo, which were often hunted to near extinction by commercial hunters transported by the rail. The Iron Horse effectively ended the Native American way of life on the Great Plains and marked the final decisive victory of manifest destiny. The closure of the frontier. The railroad was the final nail in the coffin of the open American frontier, already declared closed in the 1890 census. It eliminated the psychological space of the unknown wilderness, replacing it with the rigid schedule of the modern machine. The West was no longer a mysterious, isolated region. It was part of the American economic and political network. The dawn of the Gilded Age.
The financing and execution of the railroad, however, established a dark template for American industrial development. It cemented the power of the corporate titan, like the Big Four and the Ames brothers, and proved the effectiveness of political corruption on a national scale. The scandalous profits and consolidation of power associated with the railroad set the stage for the enormous monopolies and social inequalities that would define the Gilded Age. The Iron Horse physically bound the continent together, fulfilling Lincoln's vision of unity. Yet in doing so, it simultaneously accelerated the destruction of Native American culture, enshrined corporate power, and fundamentally reorganized the American landscape into a vast, interconnected industrial machine.
The Oklahoma land runs, which continued throughout the 1890s as the remaining tribal lands were broken up by the Dawes Act, were a powerful, final expression of the frontier ideal. It confirmed that the government was willing to violate its most sacred treaties to satisfy the demand for land. The runs were a clear statement. There was no longer any land in the continental U.S. that was permanently off-limits to white settlement. The rush became the symbolic capstone of the frontier era, a chaotic, desperate race for the last vestige of the promise of free land. With the fertile lands claimed, the final frontier lay in the semi-arid, often hostile environment of the Great Basin in the Intermountain West, where annual rainfall rarely exceeded 15 inches. The old farming adage, "rain follows the plow," proved a tragic delusion. The traditional 160-acre Homestead Act plot, which worked in the moist Midwest, was fatally inadequate in the arid West, where a farmer needed 10 times that much land just to sustain a small herd. The individual pioneers' methods had reached a definitive environmental limit. The solution was not individualism, but collectivism. To make the desert bloom, the federal government had to step in and literally change the landscape. This new approach was formalized by the Reclamation Act of 1902, championed by conservationists and Western politicians. The act established the U.S. Reclamation Service, later the Bureau of Reclamation, and mandated that money from the sale of public lands be used to construct massive federally owned irrigation projects, dams, canals, and reservoirs, to bring water to the desert. The Reclamation Act was a philosophical revolution. It was the first major permanent departure from the doctrine of laissez-faire, individualistic expansion. Huge multi-state projects like the Shoshone Dam in Wyoming and the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona represented a recognition that the free market could not settle the final frontier. Only the immense capital and organizational power of the federal government could. The government now created the conditions for settlement, managing water, light, and life in the West. This shift brought a new set of conflicts, the water wars. The allocation of scarce river water among competing states, such as Colorado, California, and Arizona, became the central political drama of the 20th century West. Water rights, defined by complex legal precedents like the doctrine of prior appropriation, became more valuable than the land itself. The final frontier was settled not by the pioneer carrying a rifle, but by the engineer managing a blueprint, transforming the wilderness into a managed hydraulic society. One of the most unique and successful examples of settling the harsh, final territories was the establishment of the Mormon Commonwealth in the arid Great Salt Lake Basin of Utah. Unlike the individualistic, chaotic settlement of the gold rushers and homesteaders, the Mormon settlement was a tightly organized, communally driven effort that directly challenged the Anglo-American ideology of the frontier. Beginning in 1847, under the iron-willed leadership of Brigham Young, thousands of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS, trekked into the desolate, unmapped territory of the Great Basin.
Young chose this inhospitable location precisely because it was unsettled and unclaimed by the United States at the time. It was technically still Mexico, offering a sanctuary from the relentless religious persecution they had faced in the East. The success of the Mormon settlement was entirely due to its collective structure. Young immediately organized the settlers to build extensive communal irrigation systems, diverting scarce mountain water to make the desert floor arable. He did not grant individual land claims. Instead, the community owned the water and the land, allotting it based on need and labor. This cooperative model, combined with meticulous town planning and a powerful religious hierarchy, allowed them to overcome the environmental challenges that had defeated individual homesteaders elsewhere. The Mormon success, however, led to an inevitable clash with the federal government. The territory's unique practices, particularly the open practice of polygamy, were deemed offensive and illegal by Washington. The Utah War of 1857 to 1858 and subsequent decades of political maneuvering saw the federal government assert its authority, sending troops and enacting legislation to force assimilation. The conflict ended with the Mormons officially abandoning polygamy, and Utah finally achieved statehood in 1896. But the legacy of the Mormon Basin remained, a powerful demonstration that successful settlement of the final marginal lands required collective action and a rejection of the classic frontier individualism. The mining frontier, which had started with the chaotic democracy of the California gold rush, culminated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the last great short-lived gold rushes and the irreversible shift toward corporate consolidation. The final bonanzas were concentrated in the mountainous, heavily contested regions and, crucially, in the subarctic wasteland of Alaska. The final phase of mining required massive capital and technical expertise. Individual prospectors could no longer simply pan for surface gold. They needed hydraulic cannons to blast away mountainsides, leaving catastrophic environmental damage, or deep shaft mines requiring heavy machinery, railroads, and thousands of wage laborers. The Comstock lode in Nevada and the deep copper mines of Montana transitioned rapidly from pioneer territory to industrial corporations, dominated by figures like the Anaconda Copper King, Marcus Daly. The cowboy capitalism of the frontier was replaced by the rigid, hierarchical structure of the corporation. The last frenzy of the pioneer ideal occurred thousands of miles north in the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1899. The discovery of gold in the Yukon Territory, Canada, and later in Nome, Alaska, triggered a massive, desperate stampede of over 100,000 people. The journey through the deadly Chilkoot Pass and the treacherous Yukon River was so brutal that only about 30,000 actually reached the goldfields. Unlike earlier rushes, this was heavily regulated by Canadian and U.S. authorities, requiring prospectors to bring a year's worth of supplies, further demonstrating the increasing organizational control over the final frontier. The Klondike was a final, romanticized echo of the individualistic dream, yet its ultimate consequence was corporate. The surface gold was quickly exhausted, and within a few years, large corporations with capital for massive dredging equipment dominated the field. The last open mining frontier was closed not by exhaustion of the resource, but by the triumph of industrial organized capital over the lone prospector. The story of the final frontier must include the massive cold domain of Alaska, the last great land acquisition before the 20th century. Purchased from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million, an act widely derided at the time as Seward's Folly, after Secretary of State William Seward, Alaska was initially viewed as an icebound wasteland, an economic blunder that added nothing but debt to the federal balance sheet. For the next 2 decades, Alaska was neglected. It was governed sporadically by the military and the customs service, with little political structure. Its initial value lay in sealing, fishing, and timber, resources that primarily benefited absentee corporations, not pioneers. The region's vast indigenous populations, the Inupiat, Yupik, Aleut, Tlingit, and Haida, continued their traditional lives, largely ignored by a distant federal government, though they too would eventually face the devastating pressures of assimilation and resource exploitation.
The situation changed dramatically with the Klondike Gold Rush and subsequent discoveries in Nome and Fairbanks. Suddenly, the U.S. realized the immense mineral wealth of its northern possession. The rush forced the government to act decisively, establishing rudimentary laws, customs offices, and the first permanent civil government in 1900. Alaska's settlement was thus driven by a combination of mineral greed and strategic necessity, serving as a buffer against Russia and an access point to the Pacific. Unlike the contiguous American West, Alaska was settled primarily through marine routes and defined by its vastness and cold. The pioneers, often miners, fishermen, and adventurers, established small, isolated coastal towns and inland camps. The permanent infrastructure, the Alaska Railroad, built in the 1910s, was built by the federal government to connect the ports to the mineral-rich interior. Alaska thus became a microcosm of the final frontier era. A land defined by corporate resource extraction, federal infrastructure, and the immense, unyielding power of the natural environment, which consistently humbled the individual settler and demanded collective, organized effort. It was the last territory that embodied the sheer scale and challenge of the American expansionist dream. The Census Bureau's dry declaration in 1890 quickly found its intellectual voice in the young historian Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Turner delivered his seminal essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. His thesis was revolutionary. The frontier, he argued, was not just a geographic line, but the crucible that forged the unique American character. Turner asserted that the continuous process of settling the West, moving out of civilization and confronting the wilderness, had perpetually revitalized American democracy and individualism. The frontier, he claimed, had fostered democracy, independence, practicality, and a rejection of European aristocratic tendencies. He posited that the unique institutions and democratic spirit of the United States were not transplanted from Europe, but were born of the continuous engagement with the wilderness. Therefore, the official closing of the frontier in 1890 was for Turner and his followers the most important moment in American history since the Revolution. It meant that the era of unlimited opportunity was over, and the very engine of American uniqueness was gone. Turner's thesis quickly became the dominant paradigm for interpreting American history, creating a pervasive cultural anxiety. If the safety valve of the West was closed, where would future generations go to escape poverty, social rigidities, and class conflict? Would America now face the social and labor struggles that plagued densely settled Europe? The anxiety manifested politically and socially. It fueled the progressive era's push for social reforms, to clean up the cities now that they couldn't empty them into the West. It was cited by those advocating for American imperialism in the Spanish-American War, arguing that if the frontier was closed at home, the nation needed new overseas frontiers in Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico to maintain its virility and opportunity. Turner's influential, though historically flawed, thesis cemented the frontier myth as the defining narrative of the nation, even as the reality shifted towards industrialization and global power. The closure became a psychological starting gun for the turbulent 20th century. The end of the physical frontier led to a critical psychological and political transformation, the birth of the conservation movement. When the land was limitless, waste was tolerable. When the land became finite, preservation became a national necessity. The realization that the wilderness was not an endless commodity, but a fragile resource, spurred a demand for government protection. President Theodore Roosevelt, a passionate outdoorsman and a Turner disciple, became the movement's champion. Roosevelt's administration, aided by figures like Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, adopted a policy of wise use conservation. This movement sought to manage America's remaining natural resources, forests, water, and minerals, for the public good, rejecting the pure exploitation that had characterized the frontier era. Roosevelt used his executive authority to create the U.S. Forest Service, establish 5 national parks, 18 national monuments,
150 national forests, and permanently set aside millions of acres of western land from private exploitation. This new policy created a permanent managed wild in the West, vast public lands managed by the federal government, the Forest Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, that remain controversial to this day. The conflict over these lands between environmentalists seeking preservation and corporations and local ranchers seeking resource access is the enduring legacy of the final frontier. The settling of the last open territories also left a difficult moral and material legacy. The process secured the American continent, creating the superpower we know today, but it did so by institutionalizing the trauma of Native American subjugation, the reservation system, and ecological devastation, the fate of the bison, and the hydraulic management of rivers. The final frontier stripped away the romanticized individualism of the pioneer, replacing it with the reality of corporate power, federal bureaucracy, and the complex, interlinked problems of a modern industrial society. The closure of the frontier forced America to mature, transitioning from an expanding republic focused on land to a consolidating power focused on infrastructure, global influence, and the challenging, perpetual struggle to define liberty within its now fixed continental borders. The closure of the frontier, announced bureaucratically by the Census Bureau in 1890, was not a geographic fact as much as a cultural shockwave. The end of the trail marked the physical consolidation of the United States from an expanding republic into a defined nation-state. But its true significance lay in the profound psychological shift it mandated. For almost 3 centuries, the West had functioned as the nation's safety valve, a vast, mythical space where the dispossessed, the indebted, and the socially discontent could theoretically escape the rigidities of the East and reinvent themselves. The frontier was the ultimate promise of American democracy, a perpetual opportunity for a fresh start, ensuring that class stratification and social unrest, rampant in industrial Europe, would never fully poison the American experiment.
When the frontier was declared closed, this safety valve seemed to disappear overnight. The declaration created a palpable sense of anxiety, a fear that the nation had run out of room, run out of resources, and run out of its defining source of democratic vitality. What would happen to the millions of immigrants arriving in crowded urban centers? Where would future generations find their legendary independence? This pervasive anxiety immediately fueled 2 major, seemingly contradictory movements in American life: imperialism and progressivism. The most immediate intellectual response came from historian Frederick Jackson Turner, whose 1893 essay gave academic voice to the national panic. He argued that the continuous movement of the frontier had been the single most critical influence on the evolution of the American character, fostering individualism, democracy, and nationalism. The end of the frontier, therefore, implied the end of the very forces that made America American. This powerful thesis, though later heavily critiqued, cemented the frontier as the dominant narrative of the nation's history, transforming a complex, messy, and violent process into a simplified, heroic myth of democratic conquest. The end of the trail thus marked the transition from the era of conquest to the era of interpretation, where the battle over the West was now fought not with rifles, but with histories and ideologies. Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis, delivered at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, was not merely an academic paper. It was a defining moment in American intellectual history. His core assertion was that the wilderness was the crucible of American democracy. He argued that as settlers moved west, they shed the encumbrances of European institutions and were perpetually reborn as pioneers, forging new democratic structures based on equality and self-reliance. This process of returning to primitive conditions and then advancing forward defined the American spirit. The political and social ramifications of Turner's thesis were immense. If the defining characteristic of American life was the frontier, its closure meant that the future would be radically different from the past.
Turnerians worried that America would stagnate, facing the same rigid class lines and resource conflicts that plagued Europe. The myth of the frontier, the idea of a vast, unutilized space, had justified decades of expansion and moral shortcuts. Now, with the space gone, the nation faced its own internal problems head-on. This anxiety manifested in the push for social and political reform during the Progressive Era. If the physical safety valve was gone, reformers argued, society must create a social safety valve, a way to manage industrial capitalism, tame corporate power, and ensure opportunities for the working class and immigrants within the fixed borders. Turner's ideas thus indirectly fueled movements for better working conditions, trust busting, and urban cleanup. However, the Turner thesis was profoundly limited and exclusionary. It focused almost exclusively on the experience of the white Anglo-American male pioneer, effectively erasing the historical significance of Native Americans, Hispanics, African Americans, and women. In Turner's narrative, indigenous peoples were merely an obstacle to be overcome, not sovereign inhabitants with their own histories. By simplifying the conquest into a heroic march of democracy, Turner provided a comforting yet fundamentally flawed framework for the nation to interpret its bloody past and confront its uncertain future. The legacy of the thesis remains dual. It shaped the American worldview for a century, but it necessitated generations of subsequent historical effort to correct its exclusionary focus. The moment the real frontier closed, the imaginary Wild West was born. The gap created by the census report was instantly filled by an aggressive, commercialized myth designed for mass consumption. The rough reality of poverty, brutal labor, and bureaucratic control was replaced by a simplified, heroic narrative of cowboys, Indians, and shootouts. The primary architect of this transformation was William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, whose spectacular Wild West show became one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the world. Cody's show, launched in 1883, was a meticulously choreographed historical fantasy. It featured staged conflicts, sharpshooting demonstrations by stars like Annie Oakley, and critically, appearances by real indigenous figures like Sitting Bull, who toured briefly with the show. The show presented a sanitized, highly dramatic version of the conquest: the brave pioneer, the gallant scout, Cody himself, and the vanquished yet noble savage. It celebrated manifest destiny as inevitable entertainment, effectively packaging the pain and complexity of the Indian Wars into a spectacular, digestible format for global audiences. Parallel to the Wild West show, dime novels flooded the market, romanticizing figures like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Deadwood Dick. These pulp fiction tales solidified the iconic archetypes: the solitary, morally upright cowboy, the ruthless, black-hatted outlaw, and the virtuous schoolmarm. The frontier, already a memory, was now a profitable industry built on exaggeration. This powerful mythologization served a deep cultural need. It allowed an industrializing, urbanizing America to maintain a psychological connection to its agrarian past and its values of rugged individualism. The cowboy, galloping across the silver screen, later perfected by Hollywood, became the ultimate American hero, a solitary figure dispensing justice outside the corruption of civilization. The myth was simple, powerful, and utterly detached from the multicultural, corporate-dominated, hydraulically managed reality of the actual American West. This invented West would come to define America for the rest of the world, creating a heroic image that often obscured the brutal truths of ecological ruin and cultural destruction that underpinned the real conquest. The intellectual and cultural anxiety sparked by Turner's closure thesis had immediate geopolitical consequences. Many politicians and intellectuals argued that if the domestic frontier was gone, the nation needed to seek a foreign frontier to maintain its economic vitality and masculine vigor. The West, having served as the proving ground for American national strength, was now used as the justification for American imperialism. The perfect storm arrived in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Expansionists, led by figures like Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, argued that overseas expansion into Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines was the logical continuation of manifest destiny. The closure of the continental frontier was framed as a threat to national masculinity. The cure was a vigorous military campaign to acquire new territory and project American power globally. Roosevelt, who had lived and worked as a rancher in the Dakotas, perfectly embodied this fusion of the frontier myth and global ambition. He raised the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry regiment composed of Ivy League athletes and genuine Western cowboys and hunters, framing the war as a reenactment of the heroic conquest of the West. The charge up San Juan Hill was portrayed in the press not merely as a military action, but as the reaffirmation of the superior frontier-forged American character. The result of the war was the acquisition of an overseas empire. The Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico became America's new distant territories, and the old debates about governing colonies and assimilating foreign populations were rehashed on a global scale. This new imperialism, directly spurred by the fear of continental stagnation, demonstrated that the ideology of the frontier, the belief in America's right to expand its influence over uncivilized peoples and territories, did not end at the Pacific Ocean. It simply sailed across it, transforming the United States from a regional power to a global one. The end of the trail at home led directly to the opening of a vast, controversial new trail abroad. Starting in the 1980s, the heroic, monochromatic narrative of the frontier, largely enshrined by Turner and the Wild West myth, faced a profound academic challenge from a movement known as the New Western History. This wave of scholarship sought to tear down the myth of the triumphant democratic pioneer and replace it with a more complex, honest, and often brutal account of conquest, exploitation, and multicultural reality.
The new Western historians, such as Patricia Limerick, argued that the West was not a narrative of arrival and triumph, but one of conquest, continuity, and conflict. They stressed that the forces of the West, boom and bust economic cycles, federal dominance, and ethnic tension, did not end in 1890. They persisted, shaping the region well into the 20th century. This history was not a progressive drama, but an ongoing saga of intertwined conflicts. Crucially, the revisionists centered the experience of those whom Turner had ignored. Indigenous voices, they focused on the brutal history of forced removal, the trauma of the reservation system, and the remarkable resilience and persistence of native nations. The story of the West was rewritten, not as a successful frontier movement, but as a systematic genocide and dispossession. Multiculturalism. They highlighted the contributions and struggles of Mexican Americans, Chicanos, whose land and culture were violently annexed after the Mexican-American War, as well as Chinese, Japanese, and African-American laborers who built the infrastructure, but were subjected to brutal racial discrimination. Environmental ruin. They shifted focus from the heroic pioneer conquering the land to the devastating ecological consequences of hydraulic mining, overgrazing, and destructive logging, a legacy of resource depletion that required constant federal intervention. The new Western history offered a necessary, painful corrective. It forced the nation to grapple with the frontier's darker material and moral legacies, that the democracy of the West was built on systemic racism, federal subsidy, and catastrophic violence. By shattering the cherished myth of the simple, rugged individualist, the revisionists paved the way for a deeper, more inclusive understanding of how the West truly shaped America, through its enduring conflicts rather than its simplistic triumphs. Perhaps the most significant and painful legacy of the closed frontier is the unresolved issue of Native American sovereignty and historical trauma.
The end of the trail for the settlers was the beginning of an era of deep psychological and material crisis for the indigenous population, institutionalized within the reservation system. The policies of the late 19th century, the Dawes Act, the boarding schools, and the prohibition of sacred ceremonies were explicitly designed to eliminate native culture and tribal identity. While these policies failed to achieve complete cultural erasure, they inflicted deep intergenerational wounds that define reservation life to this day. The forced dependency on the federal government, the land base crippled by allotment, and the poverty resulting from systemic neglect became the new, permanent form of oppression. The 20th century became a story of resilience and legal struggle. From the emergence of pan-Indian political organizations like the National Congress of Indians, NCAI, to the radical direct action of the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s, the fight shifted to courts and public opinion. The Wounded Knee incident of 1973, a 71-day standoff between AIM activists and federal authorities, brought the unresolved issues of treaty rights and poverty back into the national consciousness with force. The ultimate goal of this post-frontier struggle has been the restoration of true tribal sovereignty, the right to govern themselves, manage their own lands, and control their own economies, free from BIA paternalism. Cases concerning water rights, casino operations, and cultural patrimony continue to define the ongoing effort to reverse the effects of the final conquest. The historical truth remains: the United States cannot fully reconcile its democratic ideals without first grappling with and correcting the systematic injustices inflicted upon the continent's original sovereigns during the closing of the frontier. The trail ended, but the moral accounting has never ceased. The closure of the frontier forced a dramatic reevaluation of the nation's relationship with its environment. As long as the West seemed limitless, the ethic was simple exploitation. Take what you need and move on. The devastating consequences of this ethic, the near extinction of the bison, the hydraulic mining ruins, the dust storms caused by overplowing, and the deforestation of massive tracts could no longer be ignored. The realization that American resources were finite led to the institutionalization of the conservation movement. The movement split into two major philosophies: preservation, Muir, championed by figures like John Muir, advocated for setting aside pristine areas as permanent wilderness untouched by human development. This led to the growth of the National Park Service, designed to protect natural wonders for their inherent spiritual and aesthetic value. Conservation/wise use, led by Gifford Pinchot, this utilitarian approach argued that resources should be managed scientifically and sustainably for the greatest good of the greatest number over the longest time. This led to the creation of the U.S. Forest Service, focused on managing timber and grazing lands. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency permanently enshrined the federal government as the dominant landowner and environmental manager in the West. His massive expansion of national forests, parks, and monuments represented a fundamental rejection of the pioneers' right to unfettered private exploitation. The political conflicts over land use, ranchers versus environmentalists, miners versus preservationists, that rage across the western states today are the direct continuing legacy of this conservation revolution sparked by the end of the trail. The new fight was no longer over conquering the wilderness, but over how to manage the managed wild that remained. The physical closure of the frontier did not eliminate its influence. It merely transformed it into a powerful, malleable metaphor that continues to shape American political rhetoric, corporate culture, and foreign policy. The end of the trail became the beginning of the new frontier, a rhetorical device used to frame every subsequent national challenge. Presidents and leaders consistently invoked the spirit of the pioneer to justify new ventures. Franklin D. Roosevelt invoked the spirit of collective action and boldness to justify the New Deal, framing the fight against the Great Depression as a new kind of frontier to conquer.
The new Western historians, such as Patricia Limerick, argued that the West was not a narrative of arrival and triumph, but one of conquest, continuity, and conflict. They stressed that the forces of the West, boom and bust economic cycles, federal dominance, and ethnic tension, did not end in 1890. They persisted, shaping the region well into the 20th century. This history was not a progressive drama, but an ongoing saga of intertwined conflicts. Crucially, the revisionists centered the experience of those whom Turner had ignored. Indigenous voices, they focused on the brutal history of forced removal, the trauma of the reservation system, and the remarkable resilience and persistence of native nations. The story of the West was rewritten not as a successful frontier movement, but as a systematic genocide and dispossession. Multiculturalism. They highlighted the contributions and struggles of Mexican Americans, Chicanos, whose land and culture were violently annexed after the Mexican-American War, as well as Chinese, Japanese, and African American laborers who built the infrastructure but were subjected to brutal racial discrimination. Environmental ruin. They shifted focus from the heroic pioneer conquering the land to the devastating ecological consequences of hydraulic mining, overgrazing, and destructive logging, a legacy of resource depletion that required constant federal intervention. The new Western history offered a necessary, painful corrective. It forced the nation to grapple with the frontier's darker material and moral legacies, that the democracy of the West was built on systemic racism, federal subsidy, and catastrophic violence. By shattering the cherished myth of the simple, rugged individualist, the revisionists paved the way for a deeper, more inclusive understanding of how the West truly shaped America, through its enduring conflicts rather than its simplistic triumphs. Perhaps the most significant and painful legacy of the closed frontier is the unresolved issue of Native American sovereignty and historical trauma. The end of the trail for the settlers was the beginning of an era of deep psychological and material crisis for the indigenous population, institutionalized within the reservation system. The policies of the late 19th century, the Dawes Act, the boarding schools, and the prohibition of sacred ceremonies were explicitly designed to eliminate native culture and tribal identity. While these policies failed to achieve complete cultural erasure, they inflicted deep intergenerational wounds that define reservation life to this day. The forced dependency on the federal government, the land base crippled by allotment, and the poverty resulting from systemic neglect became the new, permanent form of oppression. The 20th century became a story of resilience and legal struggle. From the emergence of pan-Indian political organizations like the National Congress of Indians, NCAI, to the radical direct action of the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s, the fight shifted to courts and public opinion. The Wounded Knee incident of 1973, a 71-day standoff between AIM activists and federal authorities, brought the unresolved issues of treaty rights and poverty back into the national consciousness with force. The ultimate goal of this post-frontier struggle has been the restoration of true tribal sovereignty, the right to govern themselves, manage their own lands, and control their own economies, free from BIA paternalism. Cases concerning water rights, casino operations, and cultural patrimony continue to define the ongoing effort to reverse the effects of the final conquest. The historical truth remains. the United States cannot fully reconcile its democratic ideals without first grappling with and correcting the systematic injustices inflicted upon the continent's original sovereigns during the closing of the frontier. The trail ended, but the moral accounting has never ceased. The closure of the frontier forced a dramatic reevaluation of the nation's relationship with its environment. As long as the West seemed limitless, the ethic was simple exploitation. Take what you need and move on. The devastating consequences of this ethic, the near extinction of the bison, the hydraulic mining ruins, the dust storms caused by overplowing, and the deforestation of massive tracts, could no longer be ignored. The realization that American resources were finite led to the institutionalization of the conservation movement. The movement split into two major philosophies: preservation, Muir, championed by figures like John Muir, advocated for setting aside pristine areas as permanent wilderness untouched by human development. This led to the growth of the National Park Service, designed to protect natural wonders for their inherent spiritual and aesthetic value. Conservation/wise use, led by Gifford Pinchot, this utilitarian approach argued that resources should be managed scientifically and sustainably for the greatest good of the greatest number over the longest time. This led to the creation of the U.S. Forest Service, focused on managing timber and grazing lands. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency permanently enshrined the federal government as the dominant landowner and environmental manager in the West. His massive expansion of national forests, parks, and monuments represented a fundamental rejection of the pioneers' right to unfettered private exploitation. The political conflicts over land use, ranchers versus environmentalists, miners versus preservationists, that rage across the western states today are the direct continuing legacy of this conservation revolution sparked by the end of the trail. The new fight was no longer over conquering the wilderness, but over how to manage the managed wild that remained. The physical closure of the frontier did not eliminate its influence. It merely transformed it into a powerful, malleable metaphor that continues to shape American political rhetoric, corporate culture, and foreign policy. The end of the trail became the beginning of the new frontier, a rhetorical device used to frame every subsequent national challenge. Presidents and leaders consistently invoked the spirit of the pioneer to justify new ventures. Franklin D. Roosevelt invoked the spirit of collective action and boldness to justify the New Deal, framing the fight against the Great Depression as a new kind of frontier to conquer.
John F. Kennedy famously defined his presidency as the era of the new frontier, using the language of exploration and individualism to challenge Americans to tackle domestic issues like poverty and, most notably, the space race. The quest to reach the moon became the ultimate, sterile, and safe continuation of the Westward drive, substituting space for land. Later, technological innovation became the digital frontier, where figures like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were cast as modern-day disruptive pioneers, blazing new trails in the corporate wilderness of cyberspace. The metaphor remains potent because it provides a convenient, heroic framework for ambition, while simultaneously allowing the nation to sidestep the moral complexities of the original conquest. The image of the solitary, courageous cowboy still dominates American culture and, crucially, foreign policy. The self-reliance and moral clarity associated with the Western hero are often projected onto international conflicts, simplifying global crises into a clear division between good and evil, much like the black and white morality of a dime novel. In the final analysis, the significance of the frontier is not found in the line that vanished in 1890, but in the stories America chooses to tell itself about that line. The West was not merely a place, it was a process,
a process of dispossession, demographic change, democratic aspiration, and environmental ruin. The long trail of American history, from the first colonial settlement to its status as a global power, cannot be understood without acknowledging that the struggle for the continent defined its institutions, fueled its growth, and permanently stained its conscience. The end of the trail was not a conclusion, but a forced introspection, compelling America to look away from the horizon and finally confront the immense, complex legacy it had built upon the conquered land. That confrontation, the continuous struggle to define liberty, justice, and opportunity within finite borders, is the final and enduring meaning of the American frontier. The physical frontier may have vanished in 1890, but its most potent symbol, the cowboy, galloped undiminished into the 20th century, becoming the quintessential American archetype. The historical reality of the cowboy, a poorly paid, racially diverse wage laborer navigating harsh economic cycles, was instantly eclipsed by the myth created by Hollywood, dime novels, and popular imagination. The mythical cowboy, perfected on screen by actors like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, represented everything the rapidly industrializing, bureaucratized nation longed for: rugged individualism, moral simplicity, self-reliance, and freedom from governmental constraint. This iconic image served a critical function. It allowed urban America to maintain a psychological link to its agrarian, expansive past. The cinematic West, with its stark landscapes and clear-cut good versus evil narratives, became a moral compass for the nation. In this imagined world, justice was immediate. Laws were simple, and a man's worth was determined by his character, not his bank account. This simplified morality was exported globally, making the Western genre America's most recognizable cultural export and a powerful tool of soft diplomacy. The persistence of this iconography shaped American politics profoundly. Politicians from Theodore Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan successfully invoked the spirit of the cowboy to define their leadership, framing themselves as decisive, plain-speaking individuals ready to take on the bad guys, whether corporations, foreign adversaries, or big government, with frontier grit. Even in the modern era, the language of the trailblazer and the new frontier remains potent in corporate boardrooms and Silicon Valley, where tech innovators are routinely cast as modern-day pioneers taming the digital wilderness. The legacy of the cowboy is not just a historical curiosity. It is a continuously evolving, powerful national metaphor that reinforces core American values, even as it conveniently obscures the complex truths of the land, labor exploitation, and multicultural reality of the actual historical West. The myth endures because it simplifies the American narrative into a heroic quest. One of the most paradoxical and enduring legacies of the westward expansion is the dominance of the federal government over the very region whose values champion anti-government individualism. The conquest of the West was not achieved by individual pioneers alone. It was financed, organized, surveyed, militarily defended, and ultimately managed by Washington, D.C. The federal government, through institutions like the General Land Office, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation, retained ownership of massive tracts of land. Today, the federal government still controls nearly half of the land area in the western states, especially in states like Nevada, which is almost 85% federally owned. This centralized control created a permanent, fundamental tension in Western politics, the conflict between the local, individualistic settler and the distant, powerful federal bureaucrat. This tension crystallized in the late 20th century with the Sagebrush Rebellion, a political movement led by Western conservatives and ranchers demanding that the federal government cede control of public lands to the states or private hands. They viewed the federal agencies, the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, as foreign occupiers, limiting economic enterprise and state sovereignty. The federal presence, however, is a double-edged sword. While residents decry the bureaucracy, the same federal control provides massive economic benefits through military bases, national park tourism, reclamation or water projects, and grazing permits. The West remains politically dependent on the federal infrastructure that first enabled its settlement. The legacy is a permanent political identity defined by a vocal, individualistic resistance to the very power structure that created and sustains the region, leading to continuous legal battles over resource rights and land use that reflect the unceasing struggle between local self-determination and national authority. The West's economic role in the American story has evolved from a repository of raw materials to a center of global innovation, yet the pattern of boom and bust remains. The initial economic engine, fur, gold, silver, and timber, was defined by rapid exploitation, sudden wealth, and inevitable collapse, leaving behind ghost towns and environmental scars. This cyclical, high-risk, high-reward economy deeply ingrained a mentality of speculation and rapid growth that persists today.
The 20th century saw the emergence of a new, industrialized West. The abundance of federally subsidized water and cheap hydroelectric power, provided by massive dams built under the Reclamation Act, fueled the region's transformation into a hub for defense and aerospace industries during the Cold War. Places like Los Angeles, San Diego, and Seattle became centers for aircraft manufacturing, aerospace research, and military bases. The economic legacy of federal intervention was clear. The government created the conditions for the modern, diversified Western economy. The most recent iteration is the Silicon Frontier. The same spirit of risk, disruption, and rapid wealth generation that characterized the gold rush found its modern form in the technology sector, particularly in Silicon Valley. Tech entrepreneurs are regularly recast as pioneers venturing into the digital unknown. This new economic boom, however, has replicated the old frontier's problems: massive inequality, rapid gentrification, and environmental pressure. The economic legacy of the West is thus a continuous, unstable cycle of intense, resource-driven speculation, constantly shifting its focus from extracting gold from the earth to extracting data from the ether, always leaving behind a stratified society. The most physical and immediate legacy of the final frontier is the artificial construction of the hydraulic West, a society built entirely on engineering and controlling water. Without the massive dams, canals, and reservoirs built through federal projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Bureau of Reclamation, modern Western cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas could not exist. This infrastructure project, necessitated by the arid climate, remains the greatest American feat of civil engineering, but also its most persistent environmental crisis. The challenge of settling the dry territories was not merely technological, it was legal. The doctrine of prior appropriation, or first in time, first in right, where the first person to use the water for a beneficial purpose gains permanent rights, became the fundamental law of the arid West, often leading to fierce multi-state legal battles known as water wars. The allocation of every drop of the Colorado River, the Columbia River, and other major waterways is governed by complex, often antiquated compacts that benefit agricultural users, the original settlers, at the expense of urban populations, and critically, the environment. Today, the legacy of this hydraulic conquest is visible in the existential crisis facing major river systems. Years of overuse, climate change, and outdated legal frameworks have led to the rapid depletion of aquifers and the shrinking of reservoirs like Lake Mead. The frontier ethic of limitless exploitation, which saw water as a resource to be tamed and channeled, has given way to a new reality of forced scarcity and conservation. The West's future is no longer about finding new lands to conquer, but about finding sustainable ways to manage the limited resources that the conquest so dramatically reallocated and depleted. The most enduring moral scar of the westward expansion is the unresolved issue of indigenous sovereignty and historical justice. The conquest led to systemic genocide, cultural erasure, and the economic devastation of the reservation system. For the American narrative to be complete,
This history cannot be mythologized or dismissed. It must be confronted as an ongoing moral imperative. The 20th and 21st centuries have been marked by the relentless legal and political fight for self-determination. After the disastrous assimilation policies were largely abandoned by the 1930s with the Indian Reorganization Act, the fight shifted to restoring political and economic control. Key movements like the American Indian Movement used direct action to bring the crisis of poverty, treaty violations, and cultural survival to national attention. The modern legacy centers on two key areas: economic sovereignty, empowered by the development of tribal casinos and resource management, and legal sovereignty, the fight for recognition of inherent governmental powers and water rights. Every major court battle over water allocation, resource drilling, or even the placement of pipelines, like the Dakota Access Pipeline conflict at Standing Rock, is a direct relitigation of the original conquest, a struggle to enforce the treaty rights that the U.S. government systematically violated during the expansion era. The struggle for justice in the West is the measure of the American commitment to its own democratic and legal ideals, ensuring that the end of the trail is not a period of closure, but the beginning of an era of reconciliation and restoration. The mythical West, often portrayed as a homogeneous domain of Anglo-Saxon pioneers, fundamentally ignores the region's profound and enduring multicultural complexity. The westward expansion was not an entry into empty land. It was an intersection of cultures, most prominently the annexation of the vast established civilizations of Mexico. The legacy of the Mexican-American War and the resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, created a permanent cultural crossroads, marked by conflict and exchange. Millions of Mexican and Spanish-speaking residents who suddenly became American citizens overnight saw their land rights dismissed, their legal systems replaced by Anglo common law, and their culture marginalized by the incoming tide of settlers. The border, arbitrarily drawn, became a source of political tension, defining a new complex American subculture, the Chicano-Chicana identity. Furthermore, the demand for cheap labor in the mines, railroads, and agriculture transformed the West into a hub for international migration. Chinese laborers built the Transcontinental Railroad but were rewarded with the xenophobic Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. African Americans, including the Buffalo Soldiers, played a military role in the Indian Wars, yet faced rigid Jim Crow laws and segregation as soon as they settled. The West's legacy is defined by this persistent cyclical pattern, attracting diverse labor to build its infrastructure, only to enforce sharp, racialized boundaries once the work was done. The modern West, with its large Hispanic population and continuous debates over immigration and border security, is the final, ongoing testament to the cultural clash inherent in the conquest of the continent. The rhetorical power of the frontier did not diminish with the advent of the 20th century. It adapted to the existential challenges of the Cold War. The West, with its vast empty federally controlled spaces, became the ideal testing ground for the military-industrial complex. The deserts of New Mexico and Nevada were transformed into proving grounds for atomic weapons like the Trinity test site and missiles, becoming the strategic inner frontier of the nation's defense. The scientists and engineers who worked on the Manhattan Project or developed the aerospace industry were framed as modern-day pioneers, forging a new frontier of scientific discovery against the existential threat of communism. This transformation allowed the nation to maintain its self-image as a bold, conquering, technologically advanced power. The space race under President John F. Kennedy's New Frontier was the ultimate expression of this metaphor, casting the Moon and eventually Mars as the final, clean, and uncontested territory to conquer.
The West's geography proved strategically essential. Its remoteness minimized risk to the dense eastern populations, while its vast public lands allowed for the necessary secrecy and scale of military and scientific operations. The legacy of the frontier in the nuclear age is thus a contradictory one. It was the place where America secured its global dominance through science and military might.
But in doing so, it left behind a toxic legacy of nuclear contamination and environmental sacrifice zones, demonstrating that the frontier ethic of exploitation simply applied new, terrifying technologies to the land. The narrative of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States is unique and divinely favored among nations, is inextricably tied to the story of the West. The frontier provided the material evidence for this belief: seemingly endless resources, rapid economic growth, and the ability to reinvent society outside the failures of the Old World. However, the end of the trail forced a painful reevaluation. The closure revealed that America was not immune to the social ills of Europe. Its cities were crowded, its resources were finite, and its history was marked by profound injustice. The continuing struggle to define the West's legacy is in fact the continuing struggle to define American exceptionalism itself. Modern historians and cultural critics now view the West as a complex, ongoing process of negotiation, a process that began with dispossession and continues today through legal battles, environmental regulations, and cultural reclamation. The challenges facing the modern West, water scarcity, climate change, housing inequality, and racial injustice, are not new problems. They are the direct, inevitable consequences of the initial, flawed conquest. The true, lasting legacy of the westward expansion is that it defines both the height of American aspiration and the depth of its moral compromise. The stories of Daniel Boone, the gold rushers, and the Transcontinental Railroad embody the dynamic energy that built a nation. But the stories of the Trail of Tears, the Wounded Knee Massacre, and the environmental collapse of the bison herds embody the true cost of that construction. The West is not a region of the past. It is the mirror of modern America. Every major contemporary issue, from immigration and racial identity to resource management and the balance of power between the individual and the state, finds its roots and its most dramatic expression in the history of the frontier. The saga of westward expansion, the unyielding saga, is ultimately the story of America's own continuous, unfinished journey. The legacy is a testament to resilience, the economic resilience to transition from fur trapping to aerospace, the ecological resilience of the wilderness that, though scarred, endures in the national parks, and the political resilience of the indigenous nations who, despite everything, persist and reclaim their sovereignty. The historical trail may have ended physically in 1890, but the intellectual and moral reckoning continues. The final, enduring meaning of the American frontier is not found in the celebration of its conquest, but in the commitment to repair its damage and to integrate the excluded voices into the national narrative. The West remains the laboratory for American identity, constantly challenging the nation to live up to the ideals of liberty and justice that it so aggressively claimed for itself. The saga of the frontier is eternal because the fundamental questions it posed, who belongs, who controls the land, and what is the true price of progress, are the questions America must answer every single day. The sun setting on the Pacific coast is not a final curtain. It is the daily reminder that the greatest frontier America faces is no longer geographical, but ethical and societal. The shaping of American identity is not complete. It is a legacy still being written by every generation that inherits the conquered land.